Arthur Harrington didn't hesitate. He didn't pace the floor or wrestle with his conscience or stare at the fire until the right words came to him. He simply picked up the pen, pressed the nib to the contract, and signed his daughter's life away in the same practiced hand he used to sign railroad acquisitions and land deeds and letters of termination. His jaw was set. His breathing was even. The glass of bourbon at his elbow hadn't been touched. This wasn't a decision that required drink. It was business, clean, necessary, already decided before he'd even sat down. He folded the document, sealed it with wax, and handed it to the man standing across the desk without looking up. "She leaves Friday," he said. "Make sure there's no trail." If you've ever wondered what it looks like when a father sells his own daughter, not to poverty, not to hardship, but to disappearance, it looks exactly like that. Quiet, efficient, ordinary. Don't go anywhere, because what Penelope does next will change everything you think you know about survival, strength, and what a woman is capable of when the world leaves her with nothing. Subscribe to the channel now so you don't miss a single chapter of this story, and hit that like button before we go any further. And drop a comment below telling me the city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to where it all began. The gala had been Penelope Harrington's idea of a slow death. Not literally. She knew the difference. She'd read enough books, enough histories, enough poetry quietly borrowed from her father's library to understand what real suffering looked like. But there was a particular kind of dying that happened in a ballroom, in a dress that cost more than most men earned in a year, surrounded by people who looked at you and found you wanting. She'd been doing it for years. Standing at the edge of the room while other women swept through it, smiling until her face ached, pretending she didn't hear what they said when they thought she was out of earshot. Such a shame about Arthur's girl. You'd think with all his money, he could have done something about it. I heard she eats like a field hand. She was 23 years old, and she had spent the better part of those years learning how to make herself smaller in a body that refused to cooperate with that ambition. She was not small. She had her mother's wide shoulders, her mother's strong hands, her mother's stubbornness, and not one piece of her mother's luck, because her mother had died when Penelope was 8 and left her alone in that house with Arthur Harrington and his particular brand of love, which felt less like love and more like management. The Clarendon Hotel ballroom was dressed for the occasion. Candles everywhere, which was extravagant given that Denver had electric lights now in some of the finer establishments. But Arthur Harrington preferred candlelight because it was softer, and because it cost more, and because it reminded the guests of older, grander things, of wealth that didn't need to prove itself. Crystal hung from the ceiling and threw light across the floor in patterns that shifted when the doors opened and cold air moved through the room. It was November, 1879. Outside, the streets were frozen, and the mountains to the west stood white and absolute against a sky that hadn't decided yet whether it was night or just late. Penelope stood near the punch table and watched her father work the room. He was good at it. She'd give him that. Arthur Harrington at 60 was still a handsome man, lean and silver-haired and possessed of a kind of gravity that made other men want to be near him and made women trust him instinctively, which was, she had come to understand, a quality that had nothing to do with character and everything to do with performance. He had been performing his entire life. He performed generosity by donating to the Children's Hospital Fund. He performed respectability by attending the right services every Sunday. He performed fatherhood by arriving at functions like this one and introducing Penelope to men he'd selected for her, in a tone that suggested she was a complicated property he was trying to unload before the market shifted. Tonight's candidate was a man named Dudley Ashworth. She'd heard the name before. Every woman in Denver had heard the name before, though not all of them would say what they'd heard out loud. Dudley Ashworth was 47, twice widowed, possessed of a fortune built on cattle and a reputation built on nothing she wanted to look at too closely. He had small eyes and a broad, soft face, and hands that he couldn't seem to keep entirely still. Always touching something, adjusting something, finding some surface to press against. He'd arrived at the gala with 2 men she didn't recognize standing slightly too close behind him, which was not normal behavior for a social function, but which no one seemed to find remarkable. Her father brought him over at 8:30. "Penelope." Arthur's voice carried that particular warmth he reserved for public occasions. the warmth of a man who was genuinely pleased with the situation he was engineering. "I want you to meet Dudley Ashworth. He's been asking after you." Ashworth looked at her the way men sometimes looked at livestock they were considering buying, assessing, calculating, not unkind exactly, but not particularly concerned with her inner life either. "Miss Harrington," he said, and took her hand. He held it a beat too long. "Your father tells me you're quite the reader." "He told you the truth," she said. "For once." There was a fractional silence. Her father's smile didn't change, but something behind his eyes went flat and cold. Ashworth laughed. "Spirited," he said, like it was a quality he was willing to tolerate temporarily. She watched him. She watched the way his hand drifted to her elbow. Not grabbing, but suggesting, guiding, claiming. And she watched the way her father looked on with a satisfaction that turned her stomach. She had been assessed before. She had been found wanting before. But something about the combination of that hand on her elbow and that look on her father's face and 23 years of standing at the edge of rooms that didn't want her moved through her like something breaking loose from a frozen riverbank. "Mr. Ashworth," she said pleasantly, "I understand you've been married twice." "That's right." "And both wives died rather young." The smile on Ashworth's face shifted slightly. "Tragic circumstances?" "I'm sure." She looked at him steadily. "Was it the isolation that did it? I've heard Ashworth Ridge is quite remote. Or was it something else?" The silence this time was not fractional. It was full and spreading and real, and the 2 or 3 people closest to them had gone very still. "Penelope." Her father's voice had dropped to something close to a warning. "I'm just curious," she said, still pleasant, still even. "Since father seems to feel this is a man I should get to know better, I thought I'd start with the basics. What became of your first wife, Mr. Ashworth? I never did hear a clear account." Ashworth's face had gone through several things in rapid succession and arrived at something cold and controlled. "She passed from fever," he said. "And the second?" "A fall." "A fall," Penelope repeated. "How terrible for you." "Penelope." Arthur's hand closed on her arm now, not suggesting but gripping, and she felt the anger in it. The specific anger of a man who has planned something carefully and is watching it come apart. "That's enough." "Is it?" She looked at her father, really looked at him, the way she rarely let herself do in public, because looking at him honestly was something she'd learned to do only in private. "I was under the impression this was a social function, Father. I'm socializing." "You're making a scene." "Am I? I thought I was asking reasonable questions about a man you'd like me to marry." She paused. "Unless the questions aren't reasonable, in which case maybe the marriage isn't either." What happened next happened quickly. She had not planned it, which was perhaps the truest thing she'd done in years. She'd been so carefully planned for so long, managed and positioned and directed, that acting without a script felt disorienting and also, she realized, absolutely right. She stepped back from both of them. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just stepped back, and in doing so removed Ashworth's hand from her elbow and her father's hand from her arm, and stood in the small clear space she'd made for herself. "I won't marry this man," she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to, because the room had gotten very quiet, in the particular way that rooms do when something real is happening. "I won't marry any man chosen for me by someone who's been trying to get rid of me since Mother died. And I'm tired of pretending this is something other than what it is." Ashworth stared at her. Her father's expression had passed through anger and arrived somewhere else entirely, somewhere that frightened her slightly, though she kept her face calm. "You'll regret that," Ashworth said, quietly enough that only the 3 of them heard it. "Probably," she said, "but not as much as I'd regret the alternative." She set down her punch glass, picked up a wrap from the chair behind her, and walked out of the Clarendon Hotel into the cold November dark. She made it 4 blocks before she started shaking, not from cold, though it was cold, the kind of dry, biting cold that Denver got in November, when the wind came down off the mountains and reminded the city exactly where it sat and how little protection the buildings really offered. She'd thrown her wrap around her shoulders but hadn't fastened it, and it wasn't helping. She was shaking from something else, the aftermath of doing something you've needed to do for years and are only now understanding the cost of. Her room at the Harrington house was on the third floor, east-facing, with a window that looked toward the mountains and a bookshelf that contained the only things in the building that were genuinely hers. She'd lived there her entire life. She'd been born in the room 2 doors down, in a bed that was now her father's guest room. She'd grown up in those halls, had learned to be quiet in them, had learned which floorboards creaked and where the light came in good in the afternoon, and how to get from the kitchen to her room without passing her father's study. She went to that room now. She did not go to her father's study. She went upstairs and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and waited for her hands to stop shaking and thought about what she had done. She was not sorry. That surprised her a little. She'd expected to find some regret under the adrenaline, some familiar voice that told her she'd been foolish and difficult, and that she should have simply smiled and been gracious and bided her time. But the voice wasn't there. What was there instead was something that felt uncomfortably like relief. She was still sitting on the bed when she heard her father come in, 2 hours later. She heard the front door. She heard his footsteps on the stairs, deliberate, unhurried, which was worse than angry would have been. She heard him stop outside her door, then the knock, which was not really a knock but a single authoritative rap, the kind that said, "I am not asking permission." "Come in," she said. He came in. He didn't light the lamp. He stood in the doorway with the hall light behind him and looked at her sitting on the bed in her gala dress, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "You humiliated me," he said finally. "I asked a man some questions. In front of half of Denver's business community. At a function I arranged specifically." He stopped, started again. "Dudley Ashworth is a man of considerable means. He was willing in spite of—" Another stop. "He was willing. Do you understand what that means? At your age, with my what, father?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The pause where the answer should have been was answer enough. "I'm not going to marry Dudley Ashworth," she said. "I told you that in the spring when you first mentioned him. I told you again in September. I'm telling you again now." "You don't have the luxury of telling me things," Arthur said. "You are in my house. You live on my money. You eat at my table. You—" "I know all of that." Her voice was very steady. She was proud of it. "I've always known all of that. I've been very aware of all the ways I depend on you, father. That's been made abundantly clear my entire life." Something shifted in his face. She couldn't quite read it in the dark. "You'll apologize to Ashworth," he said. "Tomorrow. I'll arrange a luncheon." "No." "No." She looked at him. "I won't do that. I won't apologize for asking a man why his wives keep dying. I won't marry him. And I won't keep performing at these functions like I'm a piece of livestock you're trying to sell." She paused. "I'm done with that." The silence stretched out long and strange between them. When her father finally spoke, his voice had changed, gone quiet in a way that was not calm, a way she recognized from her childhood, as the place past anger, the place where decisions were made. "All right," he said. "Just that. All right." He left. She heard him go down the hall to his study. She heard the door close. She should have been relieved. She told herself she should be relieved. Instead, she lay back on her bed in her gala dress and stared at the ceiling and felt the slow, cold understanding that she had won something tonight that might cost her everything. 3 days later, she met Mrs. Grantham. She hadn't been looking for her. She'd been in the small library on Larimer Street that she sometimes went to when she needed to think, tucked into a corner with a volume of Colorado territorial history and a cup of cooling tea. Mrs. Grantham appeared at the chair across from her and sat down without asking permission, which Penelope normally would have found rude, but which she was too startled to register as such. "You're Harrington's daughter," Mrs. Grantham said. She was a stout woman in her 60s with silver hair cut practically short and the kind of face that had stopped bothering to be anything other than what it was. "I was at the Clarendon the other night." "I don't want to discuss that evening," Penelope said. "I don't want to discuss it either. I want to warn you." Mrs. Grantham set a small leather coin purse on the table between them. "I've known Arthur Harrington for 20 years. I watched him bury two business partners who made the mistake of opposing him, and I watched him ruin a judge who ruled against him in a land case in 1874. He doesn't absorb losses. He eliminates them. Penelope looked at the coin purse. What is that? $40. It's not much, but it'll get you out of Denver and set you somewhere you can work honestly. She paused. You should leave, quietly, before he makes arrangements. What arrangements? Mrs. Grantham looked at her with something that was not quite pity. It was more like the look of someone who has watched a storm coming from a long way off and is doing what they can with the time available. When men like your father decide a problem needs to go away permanently, she said, they make arrangements. I don't know what he's planning. I know he left the Clarendon that night looking like a man who'd already solved a problem, not like a man who'd been embarrassed. There's a difference. Penelope sat with that for a moment. I can't just leave, she said. I have nothing. Everything I have is in his house. I know. Mrs. Grantham pushed the coin purse another inch across the table. Take it. Don't go back to the house tonight. Don't send word. Don't trust anyone who works for him. You're frightening me. Good, Mrs. Grantham said. You should be frightened. A little fear at the right moment is worth a great deal of courage at the wrong one. She stood up, smoothing her coat. There's a woman on Blake Street, a Mrs. Cortez, who takes in boarders and doesn't ask questions. Use a different name. Buy yourself some time to figure out what comes next. She left before Penelope could say thank you, or ask her name, or ask how she knew what she knew. She was simply there, and then she was not. Penelope sat for a long time with the coin purse in her hands. $40. The price of a problem being solved. She went back to the house. She told herself it was to collect her things, her books, her mother's locket, the small amount of her own money she kept in a cedar box under the floorboard in her closet. She was quick. She was quiet. She used the servants' entrance, which she hadn't done in years, and she went up the back stairs and down the hall to her room without passing her father's study. She was packing when she heard her father's voice through the door that connected his sitting room to the hall. He was talking to someone. She almost kept moving. She had about 4 minutes before the housekeeper came up to turn down the beds. But something about his tone stopped her. Not anger. Not the quiet place past anger. Something else. Something businesslike. She pressed herself against the door and listened. By Friday at the latest, her father was saying, I need her out of Denver before the Ashworth situation becomes complicated. A murmur she couldn't make out. A man's voice, low. I don't care about comfort, her father said. I care about permanence. The arrangement with Montgomery. Is it solid? Another murmur. He doesn't need to know the full context. He needs to agree to take her, and the rest will follow naturally. A pause. The San Juans in winter will do what needs to be done without anyone having to get their hands dirty. Do you understand me? The murmur again. Good. Friday. And Harlan. Make sure she doesn't have time to make other plans. Penelope stood motionless against the door. Her bag was half packed in her hands. The cedar box with her money was tucked under her arm. The San Juans in winter will do what needs to be done. She understood what that meant. She was not naive. She had read enough, observed enough, survived enough of her father's particular world to understand exactly what he was saying. He was not sending her away to be married. He was sending her away to die, dressed up as a marriage to give it a clean surface and a plausible explanation and enough distance from Denver that no one would ask too many questions. And she had almost walked back into the house to get her books. She didn't finish packing her room. She took the bag she had and the cedar box and her mother's locket, and she went back down the servants' stairs and out the kitchen door into the cold, and she didn't stop walking until she was 6 blocks away. She didn't go to Mrs. Cortez on Blake Street. She did something she had not planned and would not have predicted of herself. She went to the train station, and she sat in the waiting room, and she opened the cedar box and counted what she had. $62 and some coin, plus Mrs. Grantham's $40. Not enough to build a life on. Enough, maybe, to survive long enough to figure out what surviving looked like. She thought about Mrs. Grantham's words. A little fear at the right moment is worth a great deal of courage at the wrong one. She thought about her father's voice through the door. The San Juans in winter will do what needs to be done. She thought about the contract she hadn't heard fully, the name she'd caught, Montgomery, and the mountains to the west that she'd spent her life looking at through her east-facing window and thinking of as beautiful and distant and belonging to some other story entirely. She bought a southbound ticket with the last of the coin and sat in the waiting room with her half-packed bag until the train came, and she did not cry. She had cried a great deal in her life, privately, in that room with the east-facing window, but she found she had very little interest in it tonight. She was intercepted before she reached the platform. She should have expected it. She had been foolish to think she could move quickly enough. The man her father called Harlan was already there. She didn't know what he looked like, had never met him, but she understood who he was when he stepped in front of her near the gate and held up his hand with the casual authority of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed. He was in his 40s, unremarkable to look at, the kind of face you forgot as soon as it was out of your sight. He wore a dark coat and a pleasant, impersonal expression. "Miss Harrington," he said, "I'm afraid your travel plans will need to change." "I don't believe we've met," she said. "No, ma'am. I work for your father." He said it the way you might say you worked for the railroad or the territory. A simple fact, morally neutral. "He's asked me to escort you to a different departure. The 11 o'clock heading south through the pass." "I have a ticket." "I have a different ticket." He produced it from his coat. She looked at it. It was a genuine ticket, not a threat, not a piece of theater. He had already arranged this. Her father had already arranged this. "And if I refuse?" she said. He considered her with the same mild, impersonal expression. "I wouldn't recommend it," he said. "Your father is a man who tends to get what he intends to get. It saves everyone difficulty to work with that rather than against it." She looked at the platform gate. She looked at the man named Harlan. She thought about making a scene, screaming, claiming she was being abducted, demanding help from the two railroad men she could see 20 yards away. She thought about what would happen afterward, when the scene was sorted and her father's name was attached to it, and his lawyers arrived and she was returned to that house. She thought about the contract. She thought about the San Juans in winter will do what needs to be done. "What's in the mountains?" she asked. "This Montgomery. Who is he?" Something moved across Harlan's face. Not guilt, more like the brief discomfort of a man who knows more than he's saying and is practiced at carrying it. "He's a trapper," he said. "A mountain man. He operates a property up in the San Juans. Your father has arranged for you to be his wife." He paused. "It's a legitimate arrangement. Papers and everything." "Papers," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked toward the gate he'd indicated, and he fell into step beside her, not touching her, but close, close, like a man who didn't need to use force because the situation had already been arranged, so that force wasn't necessary. The 11 o'clock was a freight train with one passenger car attached, heading south through Pueblo and then cutting west and up into the mountains. It was cold on the platform and colder on the train, and she sat in the passenger car alone, while Harlan sat at the far end reading a newspaper, and she watched Denver recede through the window, the lights, the buildings, her father's city, and thought about the next thing. Not the thing after that, just the next thing. The next thing was surviving the night. The next thing was arriving wherever she was being sent and assessing what she found. The next thing was not making her father's plans convenient for him. She had a bag with 2 dresses and her mother's locket and $62 in her cedar box. She had 23 years of being told she was too much of everything wrong and not enough of anything right. She had books she'd read and remembered, maps she'd studied for no reason except that the geography of places she'd never been had always interested her, a stubbornness she'd spent years trying to sand down into something more acceptable that had evidently survived the process. She was heading into the San Juan Mountains in November to meet a man named Montgomery who had agreed to take her off her father's hands, and she did not know yet whether she was going to live or die. She pressed her forehead against the cold window glass and watched the darkness go past and thought, "All right, just that. All right." The train moved south, then west, then began climbing, and the stars above the mountains were extraordinary. More stars than she had ever seen, more than she'd known were possible. And if some other version of herself, some pampered and unthreatened version, would have found them beautiful, the version of herself sitting on this train found them simply there. Present. indifferent to her situation, and therefore, in some strange way, honest. The mountains didn't care about Arthur Harrington. That was something. They reached the end of the rail line just past dawn. A small town, barely a town, more a cluster of buildings that had agreed to be in the same place, sat at the base of a slope that turned quickly into something too serious to be called a hill. The snow here was different from Denver snow. Denver snow came and was managed and cleared from the main streets within a day. This snow had not been managed. It had simply accumulated as snow did at altitude in November, which was to say without any regard for human convenience. Harlan handed her off to a man she didn't know, a local man hired to drive her the last 11 miles by wagon. He didn't offer his name and she didn't ask. He gave her a wool blanket and indicated the wagon bed, and she climbed up and wrapped herself in the blanket, and they went. The 11 miles took nearly 3 hours. The road was not really a road. It was a track through trees that the snow had done its best to erase, and the horse picked its way with a care that suggested it knew the route and found it tiresome. The man driving didn't speak. Penelope didn't speak. They moved through a silence so complete she could hear the sound of the horse's breathing and the muffled creak of the wagon, and occasionally the distant sound of something that might have been wind or might have been something else. She had thought she was frightened on the train. She had not been frightened enough. The cabin appeared at the end of a cleared track through the pines, and it was larger than she'd expected. One main structure with a second room that looked newer, a separate outbuilding she would later learn was a smokehouse, and a barn that was solidly built and bigger than the outbuilding. There was smoke coming from the chimney. There was a horse in the yard, a big gray animal that looked at the wagon with no particular interest. And there was the man. He was standing in front of the cabin when they arrived, not waiting for them, not positioned for effect, just standing there in the way of a man who had heard them coming from half a mile out and had come to see what it was. He was large in the way that some men are large who have worked hard their whole lives. Not fat, not soft, but solid in a way that suggested his body had been shaped by specific and practical use. He was probably 35, maybe 40, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been through weather and come out the other side still functional. There was a scar along his jaw that she would later learn was from a wolf trap, though not from the wolf side of the equation. He looked at the wagon. He looked at the man driving it. He looked at Penelope. His expression was unreadable in the specific way that had taken her a long time to understand about certain kinds of men. Men who had learned to be careful with what their faces showed because they'd spent time in places where showing the wrong thing was costly. The driver handed him a sealed envelope without getting down from the wagon seat. The man took it and looked at it, and then looked at Penelope again. "She gonna stay?" the driver said. "Or am I taking her back?" The man with the scar looked at the envelope in his hand and then back at her. She met his eyes. She didn't know what she was trying to communicate. She wasn't sure she was trying to communicate anything except maybe I am a person, not a package, and I am watching you decide my fate, so look carefully. He looked carefully. "She's staying," he said. The driver nodded and turned the wagon around. She watched it disappear back into the trees, taking the last ordinary thing with it. She was standing in snow up to her ankles in a dress made for Denver ballrooms, with a bag that contained everything she now owned in the world, on the side of a mountain in November, in front of a man whose first and possibly last name she knew only from an overheard conversation through a closed door. "Montgomery?" she said. "Caleb," he said. "Penelope." He looked at her for another moment, then looked at her bag, then at her shoes, which were evening slippers and were already soaked through. He said something she didn't expect. "Not get inside or follow me or I'll explain the situation." What he said was, "That coat isn't going to work up here." And he went into the cabin and came back with something large and dark and impossibly warm. A coat made of wolf pelts, heavy and wild-smelling, and nothing she would have touched a week ago, and held it out to her. She stood looking at it for a moment. She stood looking at him. Then she took it. She pulled it on over her ballroom dress and felt the warmth of it settle around her like something that had decided to take her seriously. And she picked up her bag and followed Caleb Montgomery into the cabin and closed the door on the wind. She did not know yet what she had walked into. She did not know about the silver beneath the mountain or the contract in the envelope or what her father had truly arranged for her. She did not know that the man who had just given her his coat had not been told all the terms of the agreement he'd signed, or that the person who had brokered that agreement had no intention of letting either of them live long enough to find out what had been done to them. She knew only that it was warm inside the cabin, and that the man who had let her in had not looked at her the way men in Denver looked at her, and that outside the window the San Juan Mountains rose enormous and indifferent and enormous again, and that she was still alive, which was more than her father had intended. All right, she thought again. Let's see what comes next. The wolf coat smelled like pine resin and something wilder underneath, and Penelope kept it on for the rest of that first day because taking it off would have required admitting she needed help getting warm, and she was not ready to admit she needed anything from anyone in this place. The inside of the cabin was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something rough and dark, an animal, maybe. Something that matched the smell of the coat and the scarred jaw of the man who'd handed it to her. Instead, it was orderly. Not comfortable exactly, not soft, but deliberate in the way of a space organized by someone who spent a great deal of time in it and had strong opinions about where things should go. There was a wood stove along the east wall throwing real heat, a table with 2 chairs that didn't match, shelves on every available surface holding tools and provisions, and this stopped her. Books. Not a few books. A genuine collection, maybe 60 volumes, organized with the spines facing out and the taller ones on the lower shelves. She didn't mean to stare at them. She stared at them. "You read?" she asked. Caleb was at the stove with his back to her, doing something with a pot that smelled like it had been going since morning. "What else would I do with them?" he said. It wasn't really a question. "I don't know. I'd assumed—" She stopped. "You'd assumed what?" He turned around then, not to challenge her, just to look at her while she sorted out what she'd assumed. His expression was the same unreadable thing it had been in the yard. Patient, maybe? Or just still. "I assumed you were a different kind of man," she said honestly. He considered that. "What kind?" "The kind who doesn't read." He turned back to the stove. "I've met that kind," he said. "Don't have a lot to say to them." She stood in the middle of the cabin in his wolf coat and looked at the books and the orderly shelves and the 2 mismatched chairs and thought, well. Just that. Well. He fed her that evening without making anything of it. A plate of venison stew with biscuits that were not elegant but were hot and filling, and he set it in front of her and sat down across the table with his own plate and ate without talking, which she found she didn't mind. She had eaten enough meals in her life surrounded by conversation that was really performance, and the silence here was a different kind, the kind that had nothing to prove. Halfway through the meal, she said, "What did the envelope say?" He didn't look up from his plate. "Which part do you want to know about?" "Whatever part explains why I'm here." He chewed, swallowed, set his fork down with a deliberateness that she would come to recognize as the way he moved through things he was thinking carefully about. "It said your father wanted a husband for you, someone capable of managing a wife in difficult circumstances. Said you were—" He stopped. "Said I was what?" "Headstrong," he said. "Said you were headstrong and had embarrassed the family and needed a firm hand." She laughed. It surprised her. She hadn't planned it. It just came out dry and short. "A firm hand," she said. "That's what he told you. That's what the letter said." He picked his fork back up. "I don't use a firm hand on people." "Why not?" "Doesn't work," he said simply. "On horses or people or anything else worth dealing with. You want compliance, you use force. You want something real, you use something else." She looked at him across the table. "What do you use?" He thought about it. "Time," he said finally, "and honest work." She ate the rest of her stew thinking about that, and when she was done she helped him clear the plates, which he didn't comment on, and then she asked where she was sleeping and he showed her the second room, the newer addition she'd noticed from outside, which had a narrow bed with 2 quilts and a small window that looked directly into the wall of pines on the north side. It was cold in there. He brought in an extra piece of wood for the small stove in the corner without being asked. "Tomorrow," he said from the doorway, "I'll find you different shoes." She looked down at her ruined evening slippers. "I can pay for them." "I know," he said. "Didn't say you couldn't." And he went back to the main room and she heard him moving around for another hour before the light under the door went out. She lay in the narrow bed under two quilts and the wolf coat she still hadn't taken off, and she listened to the wind come down the mountain and hit the cabin walls, and she thought about the name in that envelope, and about her father's voice through the closed door, and about what firm hand was a polite way of saying. And then she stopped thinking about all of it because the exhaustion of the last 3 days hit her like something physical, and she was asleep before she could decide whether she was afraid. The first week was instruction in everything she didn't know, delivered without commentary on the fact that she didn't know it. The shoes appeared the morning after she arrived. A pair of men's work boots, too large, with 2 pairs of wool socks stuffed inside them that made them fit well enough. She didn't ask where they came from. She put them on and followed Caleb out into the snow and learned in the space of that first morning how to bank a fire so it lasted, how to read the snowpack on the north slope for avalanche risk, and how to haul water from the spring without losing feeling in her hands. He taught the way she imagined a good foreman taught, not lecturing, not performing patience, just showing and then stepping back and letting her try. When she got something wrong, he said what was wrong about it, specifically, without the kind of gentle hedging she'd gotten her entire life from people who thought she needed softening. She found she preferred the directness. She made fewer mistakes when she understood exactly what the mistake had been. "You're stronger than you think," he told her at the end of that first week, when she'd hauled a full load of firewood from the tree line to the shed and was breathing hard but upright. "City living makes people underestimate what their bodies can do." "City living makes people underestimate a lot of things," she said. He looked at her sidelong. "Yourself included?" She didn't answer that, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. The dynamic between them was strange and careful, and had no models she could apply to it. They were not husband and wife in any real sense. The contract had said the word marriage, but there had been no ceremony, no legal proceeding, no moment that she could point to and call a beginning. They were 2 people in a cabin on a mountain, working together to stay alive, which was its own kind of arrangement. She slept in the second room. He slept in the main room. They ate together and worked together, and by the end of the first week had stopped working entirely around each other and started working alongside each other, which was different in a way she felt but couldn't have named precisely. She was reorganizing the supply shelf, the one area of the cabin that had struck her as genuinely disordered, when she found the document. It was not hidden. That was the first thing she registered. It was tucked between a ledger of trapping records and a territorial survey map, folded twice, with the wax seal she recognized from Harlan's envelope broken and pressed flat. She wouldn't have noticed it except that the shelf reorganization required her to move the ledger, and when she did, the document fell. She picked it up. She unfolded it. She read it. Wham. The first page was what Harlan had described, an arrangement between Arthur Harrington and a man named Caleb Montgomery regarding the placement of Penelope Harrington as wife and dependent, terms to be managed by Montgomery at his discretion, compensation to be provided in the form of a land deed to be transferred upon. She stopped. She went back and read that line again. Land deed to be transferred upon confirmation of the subject's permanent removal from Denver and inability to return, said confirmation to be provided by a named agent no later than spring thaw. Permanent removal. Inability to return. She stood at the supply shelf with the document in her hands and read the rest of it. The second page was an addendum, less formal, clearly added after the main document, written in a different hand. This was where it stopped being careful. This was where whoever had drawn it up had gotten to the part they didn't bother to dress in legal language. The Montgomery property sits above a silver deposit of significant value. Survey completed September 1879. Estimated reserves sufficient to fund a railroad expansion through the southern range. Acquisition of said property requires current occupants' removal. Arrangement with Harrington provides cover for both objectives. Subject delivered, occupant removed, land claim filed in spring. She read it twice, then a third time, because her mind kept trying to find a different interpretation and kept arriving at the same one. Her father had not sent her away to punish her. He had not sent her away to marry her off and solve the problem of an embarrassing daughter. He had sent her here because this mountain had silver beneath it, And the man who owned this mountain was standing between her father and that silver, and she was the mechanism by which both inconvenient people would be removed. She was supposed to die here. Caleb was supposed to die here. And in spring, when the snow melted and the agents came to file the claim, there would be nothing left on this mountain but opportunity. She heard the cabin door open. She heard Caleb stomp snow off his boots in the entrance. She stood at the supply shelf with the document in her hands and thought, very clearly, do not put this down. He came around the corner from the entrance and stopped when he saw her. He looked at her face first, the way people looked at faces when they needed information quickly, and then at the document in her hands, and then back at her face. His expression didn't do anything dramatic. It just settled. The way a man's face settled when something he'd been half expecting arrived sooner than he'd prepared for. You found it, he said. How long have you had this? She said. Not a question, a statement with room for him to answer. Found it in the envelope the second day. He came into the room, pulled off his outer coat, hung it on the hook. Not stalling. She had the sense he didn't stall, that he was just doing what needed to be done in the order it needed to be done. The first page was what Harlan told me. The second page was underneath. And you didn't tell me. I was figuring out what to do about it. She set the document on the table between them carefully, like she was setting down something that might detonate. What is there to figure out? This says, Caleb, this says my father intends for both of us to die up here so he can claim your land. What exactly were you figuring out? Whether you were part of it, he said. The silence landed hard. She looked at him. He met her eyes without apology or deflection, just direct and honest and slightly uncomfortable, like a man saying something he knew would land badly, but was saying it anyway because it was true. You thought I might be working with him, she said. I thought it was possible. He's your father. You arrived in a gala dress with evening slippers in a foot of snow. Didn't exactly look like someone who'd been dragged here against their will. He paused. You could have been sent to soften the situation, make me comfortable, give his people time to set up. She stared at him. Then she said, I was at a train station trying to buy a ticket out of Denver when his man intercepted me. I had $62 in my mother's locket, and I was trying to disappear. He found me anyway. Something moved in Caleb's face. There's a woman named Grantham who warned me, Penelope continued, her voice very even. She said my father was a man who eliminated problems. She gave me $40 and told me to run. I almost did. I went back to the house to get my things, and I heard him through the door telling someone that the mountains in winter would do what needed to be done. She paused. So no, I'm not part of it. I'm the other person he decided to dispose of. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, I'm sorry. She hadn't expected that. She'd expected anger or strategy or practicality, the same things she was feeling herself. But not that, not the simple plain weight of it. Your father, he started. Don't. She held up her hand. Don't tell me what he is. I've known what he is for most of my life. What I need to know right now is what we're going to do about this. He sat down at the table. He looked at the document. Then he reached across and picked it up, and while she watched, folded it and put it in the inside pocket of his shirt. Nobody's sending you anywhere, he said, and nobody's taking this land. That's not a plan, she said. That's a statement of intent. I know. He looked at her. We'll figure out the plan, but that's where we start. She sat down in the other chair. She thought about her father signing his name in even practiced handwriting. She thought about permanent removal and unable to return, and the silver that was supposedly beneath the ground she'd been standing on for a week and a half without knowing it. Tell me about the land, she said. The survey they mentioned? Did you know? Heard rumors last summer. A man came through asking to look at the North Ridge, said he was with the Territorial Geological Survey. I let him. Didn't think much of it. He paused. Should have thought more about it. You couldn't have known your geology would make you a target. No, he said, but I should have known a railroad man's charity doesn't come free. She looked at him. What does that mean? He leaned back in the chair. The land. I've had it 6 years, bought it from a man named Sellers who was heading to California and wanted quick cash. Legal deed, clean transfer. But the deed has a complication. There's a clause from the original territorial grant that says if the land transfers outside the family line a second time within 10 years of first purchase, it has to be approved by the Territorial Land Office in Denver. He looked at the window. Sellers bought it in 1872. I bought it in 1873. That 10-year window doesn't close until 1882. So if something happened to you, the land would revert to uncontested territory, and the first man to file a claim and get it approved by the land office, a land office that your father has probably had in his pocket since 1876 at the latest, would hold clear title. She sat with that for a moment. That's why the spring timing, she said. He needs us both gone before 1882, while the window is still open. Gives him the silver and gets rid of the complication, Caleb said. 2 birds. And we're the birds. We're the birds, he confirmed. She looked at him across the table. He looked back at her. Neither of them looked away. So, she said, what do we know how to do? Gut. What they knew how to do, it turned out, was work. And in the weeks that followed, work was what they did. The ordinary work of surviving a San Juan winter, which was relentless and specific and left very little room for anything else. She learned to set a snare and check it without sentimentality. She learned to skin what the snares caught, which was the part she'd expected to find impossible and found instead merely unpleasant, and then, after enough repetitions, simply a task. She learned to read the weather off the mountain's behavior, the way the wind shifted before a storm, the way the animals went quiet in the hour before snow began. Caleb taught all of it the same way he'd taught the rest, directly, specifically, without ceremony. He was not a warm man in the way she'd understood warmth from her Denver life, which was to say he didn't perform warmth, didn't deploy it for effect, didn't use it to manage people, but he was consistent in a way she'd had very little experience with. He said what he meant. He did what he said. He did not look at her body and find it wanting, which was something she'd spent so long anticipating from every man she encountered that its absence was, at first, disorienting. "You're staring at me," she said one afternoon when she'd caught him watching her practice the reload on the rifle he'd started teaching her to shoot. "You're doing it wrong," he said. "Which part?" "The grip. You're strangling it. Hold it like you're holding something that might startle, not something you're trying to control." She adjusted her grip. She fired. "Better." "There," he said. "Was that so hard to say?" "I was watching to make sure I said the right thing," he said. "Sometimes if you say something too early, it interferes." She looked at him. He was already turning back to whatever he'd been doing, as if the exchange was complete. And she supposed it was. She turned back to the rifle. The cold was the thing she adapted to last. She had thought, having grown up in Colorado, that she understood winter. She had understood Denver's winter, which was managed, coal fires and carriages and buildings designed to mitigate. The mountain's winter was something else. It didn't mitigate. It was simply there, in every breath and every surface and every moment you were outside, and it demanded your full attention, or it took something from you. She lost feeling in her left toes twice in the first month, and learned, with Caleb's help, to manage her layers and her timing and her relationship to the cold in a way that was not about conquering it, but about working alongside it, the way you worked alongside anything you couldn't control. "You're getting better," he told her one morning, watching her come in from the water hall without the shaking she'd had for the first 2 weeks. "I'm getting used to it," she said. "There's a difference." "Not always," he said. She poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot on the stove. "Do you ever miss being warm? Actually warm? Like a room in summer?" He thought about it. "Sometimes. In February, mostly. February's the month that makes you question things. What do you do about it?" "Read," he said, "and work, and wait for March." She drank her coffee. "That's very practical." "Most things are, if you let them be." She looked at him over the cup. He was at the table cleaning a trap, his hands moving with the automatic competence of long practice. She had been on this mountain for 6 weeks. She had arrived knowing almost nothing about how to exist here, and had learned, day by day and task by task, things she would not have thought herself capable of learning. And the man across the table, the man with the scarred jaw and the deliberate hands and the 60 books on the shelf, had taught her most of it without ever once making her feel that needing to learn was a deficiency. She set down her cup. "Caleb." He looked up. "Thank you," she said, for treating me like a person instead of a problem." Something moved through his expression. Not quite discomfort, more like the expression of a man who has received something and doesn't quite know where to put it. "That's not a thing that requires thanks," he said finally. "In my experience, it does." He held her eyes for a moment. Then he looked back down at the trap. But something about the line of his shoulders had shifted, and she noted it, filed it away, and didn't say anything more about it. The document came out again in January. She'd been thinking about the addendum for weeks, specifically about the phrase named agent and the timeline of spring thaw. If the plan was to confirm their disappearance by spring, then the agent had to exist. Someone Harlan knew, or someone her father had already placed in the territory. Someone who would come to the mountain in April or May, look at an empty cabin, and go back to Denver with confirmation. She brought it up at dinner. "If there's an agent," she said, "they'll come regardless, whether we're here or not. They'll want to see." Caleb put down his fork. "I know. So we can't just wait it out. We can't just survive the winter and expect the threat to go away." "No," he agreed. "We need to know who the agent is, and we need the document." She looked at the inside pocket of his shirt where he kept it. "That letter is evidence of what my father planned. If we can get to Denver with it, to the right people. Your father owns the right people in Denver. He owns some of them. He doesn't own all of them." She thought of Mrs. Grantham, who had materialized in a library and pressed $40 into her hands and known things she shouldn't have known. There are people who've watched him operate for 20 years and are waiting for something concrete enough to move on. She paused. That addendum is concrete. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He picked up his fork again, then put it back down. "Going to Denver isn't a simple thing from up here. Not in January. The passes are what? I know the passes are bad. I'm not saying January. I'm saying we spend the time between now and spring making a plan that doesn't just involve being lucky enough that no one finds us." She looked at him directly. "You've been thinking about this too. I can tell." "I've been thinking about it," he admitted. "And?" He leaned back in his chair. "I've been thinking we need more than the document. We need something they can't dispute, something that makes your father's ownership claim on the silver impossible, even if they get rid of us." He paused. "If I could get the deed formally registered with the territorial office before spring, with documentation that the 10-year clause is satisfied, but you said he has the land office. He has influence there. Maybe all of it, maybe not. But if we could find the original grantor, the man who filed the first territorial claim before sellers ever bought it, the chain of title might hold even against your father's people." He looked at her. "The original claimant was a man named Ira Coldwell. He filed in 1867. Last I heard, he was in Pueblo." "Then we go to Pueblo," she said. "It's not that simple." "It's exactly that simple," she said. "It's complicated and dangerous and probably cold, but the simplicity of it is, we go to Pueblo, we find Coldwell, we get what we need for the title chain, and we go to Denver. We find people your father hasn't bought. We put the document in front of them, and we make what he did visible." She paused. "Because the only thing that makes men like my father safe is that no one sees clearly enough what they're doing." He looked at her for a long time. She met it. "You've changed," he said. Not an accusation. Something more like an observation that surprised him. "I haven't," she said. "I've just stopped letting other people decide what I can or can't do." She picked up her fork. "Eat. And then let's figure out Pueblo." She said it matter-of-factly, like it was the next task on a list. Haul water. Check snares. Plan the operation that would dismantle her father's empire or get them both killed in the attempt. She ate her dinner. Caleb ate his dinner. And outside, the mountain went on doing what it had been doing for 10,000 years, which was simply existing, enormous and indifferent, while the people on its surface worked out what came next. Pueblo in February was not a welcoming place, but it was warmer than the mountain, and warmth had become the thing Penelope measured all other things against. They had come down through the pass in 4 days, moving in the early mornings when the light was good, and stopping before dark to make camp in whatever shelter the terrain offered. Caleb knew the route the way he knew most things. Not perfectly, not without difficulty, but with a competence built from actual experience rather than theory. He'd made this descent twice before, once in late autumn and once in a winter that he said was worse than this one, though she wasn't entirely sure she believed him. The cold at the pass had been a different order of magnitude from the cabin cold. It was the kind of cold that stopped being uncomfortable and became simply a condition of existence, like gravity, like the fact of the mountain itself. She didn't complain. She had decided before they left that complaining was a luxury she couldn't afford, and she'd held to that through 4 days of cold camps and frozen boots, and one afternoon when the wind came down the east face so hard that they had to stop moving entirely for 2 hours and sit behind a rock outcrop with the horses pressed against them for warmth. Caleb had looked at her during those 2 hours with the expression of a man waiting to see whether a thing was going to hold, and she had looked back at him steadily until he looked away first, which she counted as something. They didn't talk much on the descent. The conditions didn't invite it, and she found she didn't need it. The particular silence between them had become, over the months, a productive kind. Not empty, not uncomfortable. More like the silence of two people who had learned each other's working rhythm and didn't need to fill the space between tasks with noise. On the third night, camped in the lee of a granite shelf with a fire small enough not to draw attention but large enough to matter, she asked him something she'd been turning over since Denver. "When you agreed to the arrangement," she said, "the original one, what did you think you were agreeing to?" He was quiet for a moment, tending the fire with the automatic economy of a man who had made 10,000 campfires and knew exactly what each one needed. "A wife," he said. "The letter said a wife. Said you were educated and capable and needed a situation that matched those qualities." He paused. "Said your father was concerned you were going to end up in difficult circumstances if something wasn't arranged." "That part was accurate," she said. "Yes." He looked at the fire. The letter was written carefully. Nothing in it that was technically a lie. Just framed to produce a specific reading. "He's always been good at that," she said. "Framing things to produce the reading he wants. It's how he built everything he built." She thought about this. The people who worked with him for 20 years, most of them didn't think of themselves as doing anything wrong, because each individual thing he asked them to do had a clean surface. It's only when you see the whole shape of it that... She stopped. "That you see what it is," Caleb said. "Yes." She looked at the mountains around them, barely visible in the dark, present as pressure and mass rather than form. "Did you want a wife?" she said, "before any of this?" He thought about it with the seriousness he gave honest questions. "I thought I'd stopped wanting things that required another person," he said. "Not because I decided against it, more because the life I was living didn't leave a lot of room for it, and after a while you stop noticing the room isn't there." She looked at the fire. "That's a sad thing to say." "It's an accurate thing," he said. "Sad and accurate aren't mutually exclusive." She thought about her own version of the same thing. All the wanting she'd done that had nowhere to go, that she'd learned to fold up and put away because there was nowhere in her father's house or her father's city where it fit. "No," she said, "they're not." They were quiet after that, and the fire did what fires did, and the mountains were enormous and dark around them, and she slept better than she had any right to given the cold and the ground and the situation, which told her something about what the body knew that the mind hadn't caught up to yet. Pueblo itself was a railroad town in the particular way of towns that had grown too fast around a single industry, utilitarian and loud and smelling of coal smoke and the stockyards on the south end. They came in from the north and found a rooming house on a street that wasn't asking questions, paid for 2 rooms with some of the cash Caleb had brought from the cabin, and sat in the small common room that evening with a territorial map spread on the table between them. "Coldwell," Caleb said, tracing a line on the map. "Last address I had was on the east side near the old smelter operation. That was 3 years ago." "People move," she said. "He's 72. Men that age don't move much unless something makes them." He looked at the map. "His name is on the original grant documents from '67. If anyone can anchor the title chain against a challenge, it's him." "We should find out his situation before we go knocking on doors," she said. If my father has people watching, he won't have people watching in Pueblo, Caleb said. He'll have people watching in Denver. He doesn't know we know about Coldwell. He doesn't know we know about most of what we know. He doesn't know we know about anything, she said, which is the only real advantage we have. I'd like to not waste it by being careless. He folded the map. Then he looked at her with a sideways expression she was coming to recognize, the one he used when he'd noticed something and was deciding whether to say it. What? She said. You do that a lot, he said. Think 2 moves ahead and then say the second move like it's obvious. Isn't it obvious? To you, he said. Not critically, like a man noting a tool's specific quality for future reference. We'll go in the morning, early, before the streets fill. She agreed, and they went to their separate rooms. She lay on a bed that was softer than anything she'd slept on in 3 months, and found, to her genuine surprise, that she couldn't settle into it. She had become a person who slept on a narrow mountain bed under 2 quilts and found it sufficient. The softness here was disorienting in the way that excess became disorienting once you'd learned to do without it. Not unpleasant exactly, but not right either. Like putting on a dress that fit you perfectly last year and finding the fit had changed. She lay awake and thought about Coldwell, and about the document in Caleb's inside pocket, and about spring thaw, and about the specific phrase named agent that she'd been turning over since she first read the addendum. If the plan was to confirm their disappearance by spring, the agent had to be someone already in position, someone with access to the territorial land office and the willingness to file a fraudulent claim once the mountain was cleared. She made a mental list of what she'd need to know and in what order, and by the time she'd organized the list, she was asleep. They found Coldwell's house on the east side of Pueblo without difficulty, which was partly because the neighborhood was small enough that asking the right question of the right person produced an answer, and partly because Coldwell was the kind of man who, in any neighborhood, was known. They heard him before they reached the house. He was on his front porch in the middle of a vigorous argument with a younger man, vigorous on Coldwell's side, mortified and defensive on the younger man's, about a fence line. The argument had clearly been going for some time and showed no signs of concluding. Penelope and Caleb stood at the base of the porch steps and waited with the patience of people who have learned that interrupting a man like Coldwell in the middle of a point was a poor introduction. Told you the same thing I told your father, and I will tell your grandfather's ghost if I have to, Coldwell was saying, with the volume of a man who has spent years making himself heard outdoors. That fence line is 18 inches inside my property, as surveyed in 1871, and I have the survey, and I have had the survey, and I will produce the survey in any venue you care to name, including this porch, including right now. And if you or your people set foot on my north side again, I will file with the county, and it will not be a pleasant experience for the Bauer family in any of its generations. The younger man, Bauer, apparently, in one of his generations, retreated from the porch with the specific speed of someone who had received the same speech before and had no new response to it. Coldwell watched him go with visible satisfaction. Then he turned and noticed Caleb and Penelope at the base of his steps, with the alertness of a man who had been in enough situations to recognize when a new one had arrived. He looked at Caleb first. Something moved in his face. Not surprise, more like recognition. Montgomery, he said. Ira, Caleb said. Coldwell looked at Penelope, assessed her in the direct way of a man who had stopped concerning himself with whether assessment was polite. Who's this? Penelope Harrington, she said. The name landed. She watched it land in his face. Not dramatically, but visibly, a rearrangement of something. Harrington, he said. Arthur Harrington's daughter. Yes. He looked from her to Caleb, back to her. He was running a calculation, she could see it, and he was running it fast. Come inside, he said, and wipe your boots. The inside of Coldwell's house was the inside of a man who had lived alone for a long time and had made a separate peace with the results. Papers everywhere, stacked in arrangements that appeared to have an internal logic visible only to him. A large tabby cat occupied every warm surface with the absolute confidence of an animal that had long ago established ownership of the premises and considered the human presence a courtesy it tolerated. The coffee on the stove had been going since what smelled like early morning, and had achieved a concentration that Penelope suspected might have industrial applications. Coldwell poured 3 cups without asking. She accepted hers out of politeness and discovered it had the texture of something that had made poor decisions and the flavor of something that had stopped caring about the consequences. Caleb laid out the situation without preamble. He was good at that, identifying the essential information in the correct order and presenting it without the kind of framing that got in the way of the actual content. Penelope added what he left out, which was mostly the Denver side of it. Harlan, the train platform, the specific language of the addendum. Coldwell listened the way serious men listened, which was without interrupting and without the kind of performative nodding that substituted for actual engagement. He held the document for several minutes when Caleb produced it, reading with the focused attention of a man who had spent decades in territorial legal proceedings and understood the specific weight of specific words. When he set it down, his expression was what she would have called grim if there hadn't been something else underneath it, something that looked on a man of his particular type almost like vindication. "Harrington," he said again. 3rd time. Each time the name had carried a different charge. "You know him," Penelope said. "I know of him. Know what he did to the Reston Valley Grazing Cooperative in 75. He set the document precisely on the table. Know what happened to the Dalton Brothers coal operation in 77. Know that in 73 there was a water rights dispute in the Southern Range that ended with 2 homesteaders walking away from land they'd worked for 8 years because the alternative had been made too clear to ignore." He looked at her directly. "I know the type. Build scaffolding around the taking so it looks like something else. Looks like business, looks like settlement, looks like the natural outcomes of legal processes. Only when you see the full shape of it over time do you understand what you're actually looking at." "I grew up inside it," she said. "I didn't see the full shape until I was looking at it from the outside." Coldwell held her eyes for a moment with the expression of a man revising an estimate. "Are you telling me he sent his own daughter up a mountain in November to die so he could claim the land clean?" "That's what the addendum says," she said. Even. No tremor in it. He stared at her. She let him stare because she understood that what he was actually doing was confirming something about her. Whether the steadiness was real or performed, whether she was someone he could deal with directly or someone who needed to be handled. She'd been assessed this way enough times in the last 3 months that she could read the process. "All right," he said finally. He pushed the document back across the table. "What do you need from me?" "The original grant documentation from 1867, Caleb said. "Your filed claim. The full title chain going back to territorial first use registration. If we can demonstrate an unbroken and properly documented chain from your original filing through sellers to me." "The 10-year clause becomes moot," Coldwell said. "The clause applies to transfers that lack original grant documentation on file with the territorial commissioner. If the chain is complete and properly registered all the way down, there's nothing for a land office to exploit, no ambiguity to argue." He rubbed his jaw, which was the action of a man thinking through the mechanism of something he already broadly understood. "I filed clean in 67. I kept copies of everything. I've kept copies of everything my entire working life because I've dealt with men like the one we're discussing before, and they always come around eventually, in one form or another." He looked at Penelope. "Men like that always come around." "Can you get the documents together today?" Caleb asked. Coldwell made the face of a man being asked to move faster than his dignity strictly preferred. "Today," he repeated. Not a refusal, a commentary. "We need to move before spring," Penelope said. "Whoever my father has positioned is going to move when the pass is clear. We need to be in Denver and have this in front of the right people before that window opens." "Who are the right people?" Coldwell said. "Because in my experience, the right people in Denver are considerably harder to identify than the right documents, and they're worth less if the documents aren't there to back them up." "I know someone," Penelope said. She thought of Mrs. Grantham, the direct eyes across a library table, the $40, the specificity of warning from a woman who clearly knew more than she was choosing to say and had said exactly as much as was necessary. "She knows who my father has acquired, which means she knows who he hasn't. And we have a lawyer, a careful man, small practice, not connected to my father's interests." Coldwell looked at her. You've thought this through. I've had 3 months on a mountain, she said. There wasn't a great deal else to do. Something moved in his face that might, on a less contained man, have been amusement. Give me until 4 o'clock, he said. Come back then. I'll have what you need. He stood, which indicated the first portion of the meeting was concluded. The tabby cat materialized from somewhere and wrapped itself around his legs with the possessiveness of something that owned the place. Coldwell looked down at it with a tolerance that suggested a long and complicated relationship. One more thing, he said as they moved toward the door. He looked at Caleb. I've been hearing things this winter from a man who runs freight between here and Durango. Comes through every few weeks and talks, the way freight men do when they've been on the road a long time. Caleb went still. She noticed. He says there's a group organizing up in the San Juans, Coldwell continued. Hired men, not local, coming in ones and twos over the past month, settling into the mining camps and the edge settlements. Not prospectors, not laborers looking for work. He looked at Caleb steadily. My freight man says these men came with rifles and are being paid to wait. The word wait dropped into the room and changed the temperature of it. How many? Caleb said. His voice hadn't changed, but something had shifted in his posture. The specific alertness of a man who has just had a concern confirmed earlier than he expected. Couldn't say exactly. More than 5. My freight man thought maybe 10, maybe more. Coldwell's eyes stayed on Caleb. He said the name going around the camps was Mercer. The silence lasted 3 full seconds. You know the name, Coldwell said. Not a question. I know the name, Caleb said. Penelope looked at him. Who is Mercer? Caleb was quiet for a moment. Wyatt Mercer, he said. He runs enforcement for railroad and land interests across the territory. When someone needs a problem resolved and the legal mechanism is either too slow or too visible, Mercer is who gets called. He said it flat, factual, but she could hear something underneath the flatness. Not fear exactly, more like the particular alertness of a man recognizing a specific threat, one he'd had previous occasion to assess. You've encountered him personally, she said. We've crossed paths. He didn't elaborate. She filed the non-elaboration for later. If Mercer's already in the territory, your father moved faster than I expected. He was always going to move fast, she said. The survey was done in September. He had Harlan in motion by October. He's been executing this for months. Mercer being in the territory before the passes are fully clear is exactly consistent with how he operates. He positions things early so that when the moment comes, the mechanism is already in place. Coldwell was watching her. You understand how he thinks, he said. I grew up watching him think, she said. I thought I was learning how the world worked. I was learning how he specifically worked, which isn't the same thing, but the knowledge transfers. Coldwell nodded once, with the approval of a man who respected a specific kind of clarity. 4 o'clock, he said. Don't be late. And don't tell anyone in this town what you're here for. They had 5 hours until 4 o'clock, which was not enough time to do anything significant and too much time to do nothing. They walked. Pueblo was the kind of town that rewarded walking in the specific sense that movement was better than standing still when you were thinking through something that had just gotten more urgent, and the streets gave them somewhere to go while they talked through what Coldwell had told them. Tell me about Mercer, she said, when they were a block from the rooming house, and the street was quiet enough that the conversation was their own. Caleb was quiet for a moment. She waited. She had learned that his silences before answering certain questions were not evasion, but the actual time he needed to find the right words for things that didn't have easy ones. I was in Wyoming in the summer of '76, he said, moving between situations. I'd left a mining camp outside Leadville where the conditions were. The foreman ran things in ways that were wrong, and I said so, and then I left before the situation became something I couldn't walk away from. He paused. The foreman filed a complaint with the territorial office afterward, said I'd taken equipment. I hadn't. But the complaint was enough to make certain parts of the territory uncomfortable, and so I moved north. She walked beside him. The scar, she said. Another pause. The foreman had a preferred way of communicating with workers who raised objections, he said. The flatness of it was doing work. containing something that the flat delivery was managing so it didn't come out sideways. I left before it progressed further. He filed the complaint. Mercer was the man the foreman used when the complaint didn't accomplish what he wanted. He came after you personally, she said. He came to Wyoming. By then the jurisdiction question was complicated enough that it didn't go far. But I know what he looks like. I know how he organizes an operation. And I know what he's capable of when the jurisdictional question isn't a factor. He looked at the street ahead. The Hadley family. I mentioned them. You said you came through a week after, she said carefully. There were 3 sons, he said. Good men. Elias Hadley had filed on good land and was working it clean. Someone wanted that land and the Hadleys were in the way, and Mercer was brought in to simplify the situation. He stopped there, which told her enough. He doesn't carry what he does as a burden. That's what makes him different from just a violent man. A violent man has emotion attached to the violence, which means he makes mistakes. Mercer treats it as a professional task. He assesses, he plans, he executes, he moves on. She thought about that. So when he arrives at the cabin, he won't negotiate, Caleb said. He won't be bought off or reasoned with or frightened. He'll assess what he finds and do the job he was paid to do. He looked at her sideways. I've been thinking about this since Coldwell said the name. We can't meet this the way you'd meet a man with normal responses to risk. We have to think about it differently. I've been thinking about the North Ridge, she said. He looked at her. Say more. The boulder field on the north slope. I walked it twice this winter. There's a section, maybe 40 feet across, where the base material has been eroding since last spring's melt. The surface ground around it has a different character, cracks that go deeper than normal frost. She watched his face as she spoke. I've read enough geology to know what undermined ground looks like. If the right point of pressure was applied at the right location, the load distribution would shift and the field moves, he said. The field moves, she confirmed, not explosively, but with enough mass and momentum that anything in its path, you'd need to be above it, on the outcrop behind the upper tree line. I measured the distance, she said, to the base section, 60 yards, maybe 65. I've hit targets at 75. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. If Mercer positions himself in the approach, he said slowly, and his men fan toward the cabin from the south, the approach comes past the north section, she said. If they come from the standard direction. They will. It's the only approach that works in that snowpack. Then the field moves toward the approach, she said, not toward the cabin. He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. He was looking at her with the expression of a man who is running a calculation and finding the result unexpected. You worked this out on the mountain, he said. I worked the outline of it out, she said. I needed to know the approach pattern to confirm the geometry. You've been carrying this since before we left. I didn't want to say it until I knew whether it held up, she said. It holds up. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something she hadn't expected. You'd be up there alone, while I'm at the cabin drawing their attention to the front. Yes, she said. If something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, we adapt, she said. That's what we do. She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking your permission. I'm telling you the plan so we can discuss the parts that need refining. He held her eyes. She held his. Then he looked away first toward the mountains to the north, toward the direction of home. The outcrop approach at night, he said. In the dark, on that slope, in February snow. I've done it once, she said. I know where the bad footing is. You've done it once in better conditions than we're heading back into. Then I'll be careful, she said, and I'll practice it once more when we get back, before they arrive. He looked at her again. The expression on his face was complicated in a way she found she could read better than she once could. There were several things in it at once. The specific mix of a man who has assessed a plan and found it sound and is simultaneously unhappy about what the plan requires of the person he's come to regard as not expendable. All right, he said finally. All right, she agreed. They turned back toward the rooming house. She noted, without commenting on it, that he'd walked closer on the return than he had on the way out. Not close enough to be remarkable, just present at a different distance. the way a person adjusted their position relative to something they'd decided was worth keeping near. Coldwell was ready at 4 o'clock. The documents were in a leather folder that had clearly been in use for decades, worn at the corners, repaired twice along the spine, the kind of object that had been maintained because it contained things that mattered rather than replaced because it was showing wear. He went through each document for them at his kitchen table, with the tabby cat installed on the chair beside him, as if it had an opinion on the proceedings. The original grant filing from 1867. The survey attached to that filing. The transfer documentation when Coldwell had sold to Sellers in 1872 with the proper territorial registration number and the commissioner's stamp of that year. The transfer documentation when Sellers had sold to Caleb in 1873, similarly stamped. "The chain is complete," Coldwell said. "Every transfer registered properly. The 10-year clause in the original grant has been satisfied because both transfers were properly documented at the time of transfer, not left as private agreements to be registered later, which is where that clause gets complicated. Both transfers were filed inside 90 days of closing, which is the requirement." He looked at Caleb. "Any lawyer who knows territorial land law can make this argument clearly. Your position is stronger than Harrington probably knows." "He knew enough to try to acquire it before filing a competing claim," Penelope said. "He knew enough to try to clear the property first," Coldwell agreed, "which tells me his people did a thorough survey of the legal situation and found it less exploitable than he'd hoped, and defaulted to the simpler solution." He closed the folder and slid it across to Caleb. "This is the original set. I have copies. Don't lose it." "We won't," Caleb said. "There's something else," Coldwell said. He folded his hands on the table. "I made some inquiries this afternoon while I was pulling the documents. I know a man in the freight business here who has eyes in the southern mining camps. Broader picture than what I told you this morning." Penelope waited. "Mercer's been in the territory since mid-January," Coldwell said. "Not at the mountain. He's too careful to sit in one place that long in conditions that might shift. He's been operating from Silverton, coordinating from there, sending men out to the camps to wait." He paused. "My contact says the instruction is to move at first clearance. First week the pass is usable." "What month?" she said. "In a hard winter, late March, possibly early April." He looked at the window. The light outside had shifted to the specific gray of late afternoon in a Colorado February. "You've got 5 or 6 weeks of certainty. After that, the window is unpredictable." 5 weeks, Caleb said. He looked at Penelope. She looked at the folder of documents. She thought about the North Ridge and the boulder field and the geometry she'd worked out on the walk back from the mountain. She thought about 5 weeks to get to Denver, do what needed to be done there, and get back to the cabin before the pass is fully cleared. "It's enough," she said. Coldwell looked at her with the expression he'd been producing intermittently since the beginning of the meeting, the one that seemed to be updating something. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No one ever is," she said. "What did you expect?" "A city woman in distress," he said. "Someone who needed the situation managed for her." "I need the documents," she said. "I'll manage the situation myself." He nodded once. "Then go do it," he said, "and come back when it's settled. I want to hear how it ends." She looked at him. This old man with his folder of carefully maintained documents, and his possessed cat, and his argument about fence lines that he would win because he was the kind of man who kept the survey from 1871 and produced it in any venue that called for it. She thought about the kind of patience that required, the kind of sustained attention to what mattered and what didn't. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping the documents, for all the years you kept them." "I kept them because I thought I might need them someday," he said. "Turns out I needed them for you instead." He stood, which concluded the meeting. 4 o'clock wasn't late, he added. "Come back on time next time." They left Pueblo the following morning. She had not slept well. Not from cold this time or from an unfamiliar bed, but from the particular restlessness of a person who has all the pieces of a plan and can see how they fit together and cannot yet execute any of them because the execution requires being somewhere she isn't yet. She lay in the dark and ran through the sequence: Denver, Pratt, Mrs. Grantham, the territorial prosecutor, Harlan, the 5-week window, the mountain, the ridge, until the sequence was as solid as she could make it, and then she lay there some more because her body hadn't caught up to the point where it would release her into sleep. She was up before first light. Caleb was already in the common room with coffee and the map. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Not a question." "Enough," she said. He looked at her. "That's not yes." "It's sufficient," she said. "What time do we need to leave?" He looked at the map. "Hour after dawn, if the road is what I think it is." "Then I have an hour." She sat down. She picked up the coffee. It was better than Coldwell's by a significant margin, which was a low standard, but she was grateful for it anyway. They sat in the common room in the early morning quiet of a rooming house, and she thought about the days ahead and the days behind, and the difference between the woman who had arrived on the mountain in November and the woman who was sitting here now in February with a plan and a folder of documents and the specific calmness of someone who has been afraid enough times that fear has become a familiar condition rather than an emergency. "Caleb," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "when we've gone to Denver and come back and whatever happens on the mountain has happened, what do you want the mountain to be?" He thought about it. She appreciated that he thought about it rather than producing an answer immediately, because she was asking a genuine question, and genuine questions deserve time. "What it already is," he said finally, "but more of it, more room, more use." He paused. "There are people who come through the territory every season looking for a foothold and not finding one because every foothold is owned by someone who bought it to hold rather than to use. If we had the means—" He stopped. "We'll have the means," she said, "if the silver is what the survey says it is." "If it is," he agreed. He looked at the map. "You're already thinking about what comes after." "I think about what comes after all the time," she said. "It's how I kept going through the parts that were difficult. There's always a next thing. As long as there's a next thing, the current thing is manageable." He looked at her across the table in the early morning light of a Pueblo rooming house in February, with the folder of documents between them and the map spread out and the horses waiting in the stable out back. And he said nothing, because there was nothing to add to it that would improve on what she'd said. They left an hour after dawn, heading north and then west, heading back toward what was waiting for them, heading home. Harlan's statement arrived in 36 hours, not 48. It came through the hotel on Blake as agreed. A sealed envelope addressed to Mr. Carson, 3 pages in a careful, unremarkable hand that matched nothing so much as a man who had made his living being precise about things other people preferred kept vague. Penelope read it twice at the small table in their room, while Caleb stood at the window watching the street below with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that windows told you things if you watched them long enough. The statement covered everything she'd asked for and one thing she hadn't, a specific date in October when Arthur Harrington had first raised the subject of the Silver Survey with Harlan directly. 6 weeks before Penelope had been sent to the mountains, which meant her father had been planning this before the gala, before Dudley Ashworth, before she'd said a single word in that ballroom that could have plausibly given him cause. She'd been the plan all along. The gala had simply been the timing. She set the statement down on the table and sat with that for a moment. Not a surprise exactly. She'd understood for weeks, intellectually, that she'd been a convenience, an instrument, a mechanism of disposal that also happened to be his daughter. But there was a difference between understanding a thing in the abstract and reading it laid out in careful handwriting by the man who had escorted her to the train platform and put her on a freight car heading toward a mountain she'd never asked to see. The difference was physical. It sat in her chest like something with no clean edges that she couldn't find a way to set down. "Penelope?" Caleb said from the window. "I'm fine," she said. "I didn't ask." "I know." She picked up the statement and folded it precisely along the original creases. "It's useful. That's what matters right now." He turned from the window and looked at her with the attention he gave things he was concerned about. Not hovering, not performing care, just present in a way that she had come to understand meant he was paying more attention than his face necessarily showed. She had learned to read the difference between his stillness of disengagement and his stillness of engagement, and they were not the same thing at all. "He planned it before the party," she said, "before I did anything. The survey was done in September. He had Harlan in motion by October." She looked at the folded statement. "I think the Ashworth situation was designed to give me cause to act out, to give him a usable justification, something he could tell people afterward. She humiliated the family. She was unmanageable. He had to make alternative arrangements. He needed a story. A story with a difficult daughter at the center of it is very convenient when the alternative explanation is that he sent his daughter to die to acquire a silver deposit. "And you gave him one," Caleb said. "I did." She paused. "I'd do it again. Ashworth was—" "I know what Ashworth was," Caleb said. "His reputation travels. Men like that, their particular kind of reputation always travels further than they expect." She looked at him. "You never asked me about the party, about why I was sent." "Didn't seem like my business to ask." "It's your business now," she said. "Given everything." He came away from the window and sat down in the other chair, across the table from her, in the same configuration they'd occupied 100 times at the cabin table. It occurred to her that she felt more comfortable in this arrangement, facing him across a flat surface with something between them, than she felt in almost any other configuration she could think of from her previous life. Which said something, she thought, about what comfort had actually looked like in that life versus what she'd been calling comfort. "What happened at the party?" he said. She told him. Not the Denver social version, which would have involved careful framing and strategic omissions and the kind of self-editing she'd been doing since she was old enough to understand that honesty in her father's world was a liability. The actual version. Ashworth's hand on her elbow, the specific quality of that touch, the ownership in it that hadn't bothered to ask permission first, her father's face going flat and cold, the specific moment she'd decided she was done performing and stepped back and said what she said, and the way the room had gone quiet around it, and how it had felt like the first honest thing she'd done in a ballroom in her entire life. When she finished, Caleb was looking at the table. He was quiet long enough that she began to wonder, not for the first time, whether the unvarnished version was too much, whether the world she'd actually inhabited before the mountain was too foreign to translate across the distance between them. Then he said, "Good." She blinked. "Good." Ashworth is the kind of man who counts on women being too sensible to say the obvious thing out loud in a room full of people, he said, because the room full of people is supposed to be the deterrent, the performance of respectability that everyone's invested in together. He looked up. "You said the obvious thing, and got sent to a mountain to die for it. And instead," he said, "built a case that is going to dismantle a railroad empire." He held her eyes. "I'd call that a reasonable trade, given the options." She sat with that for a moment. The framing of it was something she hadn't quite managed herself. She'd been living inside the sequence of events too closely to see it from that angle. Hearing it from outside in his specific, flat, honest voice, it landed differently. She picked up Harlan's statement and the Coldwell folder. "Let's go see Pratt," she said. They went to Pratt's office that afternoon. He was always in, she was coming to understand, in the way of a man whose life had organized itself around the small office on the side street and who had long since stopped thinking about this as a limitation. Some people arranged their lives to have large footprints. Pratt had arranged his to have a precise one, and the precision served him better than the largeness would have. She laid out the full picture for him, not just the documents, which he'd seen, but the Coldwell visit and the title chain, and what they'd learned about Mercer and the timeline Coldwell's freight contact had given them. Pratt listened with a pen in his hand that he didn't use, in the manner of a man who wrote things down after he understood them, rather than while he was trying to. "Mercer changes the calculus," he said when she finished. "How?" she said. "It means the threat to the property isn't theoretical, and it isn't future tense. It's already in position." He set the pen down. "If Mercer moves before we can get the title formally confirmed through the commissioner, the situation on the mountain becomes an argument about what happened, rather than a clear legal proceeding about what was planned. Evidence on a crime scene is considerably messier than evidence in a document." He looked at Caleb. "I need to file with the commissioner this week. Not next week. This week." "Can you do it without us present?" Caleb said. "As the attorney of record on the title, yes. The commissioner's office requires the claimant's documentation and authorization, which I already have from when you engaged me in '73. The filing is a legal matter, not a personal appearance." He made a note. I'll go tomorrow morning. And the prosecutor, Penelope said, Aldrich, when can you arrange the introduction? Tomorrow afternoon, if he's available. He usually is on Thursdays. Pratt looked at her steadily. I want to prepare you for something. Aldrich is a man who takes his office seriously in the specific way that means he moves on cases when he believes the evidence is sufficient, not when the political moment is convenient. He's not going to be impressed by the Harrington name or intimidated by it. But he's also not going to move on incomplete evidence out of sympathy for your situation. He'll want everything you have, and he'll want it to hold up. It holds up, she said. I know it does, Pratt said. I'm telling you how he'll receive it so you're not surprised when he receives it that way. What way? Caleb said. Methodically, Pratt said. He'll read everything. He'll ask questions that seem tangential but aren't. He'll want to know about your credibility as witnesses as much as about the content of the documents, because he understands that content without credibility doesn't get a conviction in front of a territorial jury. He looked at them both. Answer everything directly. Don't embellish. Don't interpret. If you don't know something, say you don't know. The fastest way to lose Aldrich is to tell him what you think he wants to hear instead of what you actually know. Penelope looked at him. You're giving us the same advice you'd give a witness. You are witnesses, Pratt said. That's exactly what you are. She thought about this on the walk back to the rooming house that evening. The word witness had a specific weight that she hadn't fully considered. She had been thinking of herself as the person who had done something, found the document, made the plan, gone to Pueblo, confronted Harlan, built the case. But from the proceedings perspective, she was the person who had been present when things happened and could attest to what she'd seen. The distinction wasn't meaningless. It required a different orientation, not toward what she'd done, but toward what she'd observed and what she could state as known fact versus what she'd inferred. She spent that evening reorganizing her account of events in her head, not to change it, but to clarify the line between what she'd directly experienced and what she'd concluded from that experience. The exercise was useful. It was also, she found, uncomfortable in a way she hadn't expected, because there were parts of the story where what she'd concluded felt so obviously true that distinguishing it from what she'd actually witnessed required a kind of intellectual honesty that didn't come naturally when you were very certain about something. This was, she thought, probably what Pratt had meant. Quote, Aldrich's office was in a building that had been other things before it was a prosecutor's office and still carried the ambiguity of its prior uses in its architecture. High ceilings that didn't quite match the modest furniture, windows positioned for a different purpose than the current arrangement required. He received them in a room that contained 3 chairs and a desk and nothing decorative, which she found she respected. He was in his mid-50s and had the build of a man who had once been physically active and had shifted the same energy into something more sedentary without quite losing the quality of it. He shook Caleb's hand and nodded at Penelope and sat down and looked at the documents without preamble, which she also respected. He read for 25 minutes. No one spoke. Pratt made no attempt to fill the silence. Caleb sat with his hands on his knees. Penelope watched Aldrich's face and tried to read it and found very little to read, which she suspected was a skill he'd cultivated deliberately over many years of not wanting people to know what he was thinking while he was thinking it. When he finished, he squared the documents into a neat pile and set them to one side and looked at her. You're Arthur Harrington's daughter, he said. Yes. And you're bringing this to my office rather than to the city marshal or the territorial land authority because my father has the city marshal, she said. The territorial land authority has a deputy registrar named Fowler who has been on my father's payroll since 1877, according to the man who handled my father's arrangements and whose written statement is in that pile. She paused. And because the territorial prosecutor's office has jurisdiction over both the land fraud and the conspiracy to cause death and has historically been insulated from railroad influence because there's been no occasion for a railroad to need the prosecutor's office until one of them does something like this. Aldrich looked at her for a moment. Pratt said you were direct, he said. Is that a problem? No, he said. He looked at Caleb. You've owned the property in question for 6 years. Yes. During which time you had no knowledge of the silver deposit beneath it. I'd heard rumors in the summer of '79. A man came through claiming to be with the Territorial Geological Survey, asked to look at the North Ridge. I let him. Caleb paused. I didn't know at the time that the survey was privately commissioned. How do you know that now? The addendum to the contract references a private survey completed September 1879, Penelope said. A territorial geological survey of that area would be in the public record. It isn't. I checked at the Pueblo Territorial Office while we were there. No survey of the Montgomery property or the surrounding San Juan Range is listed in the public record for 1879. Aldrich looked at her. You checked the public record. While Mr. Coldwell was preparing his documents, she said, it took about 20 minutes. The public survey records are organized by county and year. If a legitimate survey had been filed, it would be there. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. He looked at the pile of documents, then back at her. The statement from Harlan, he said. He gave this voluntarily. In exchange for a written assurance that his cooperation was provided voluntarily and before any formal proceeding was initiated, she said, which I told him I could obtain and which I'm asking you to provide. I've provided similar assurances before in cases where cooperating witnesses' testimony was essential and their exposure was secondary to the primary targets, Aldrich said. He looked at the statement. Harlan's exposure in this is real but limited if his account is accurate. He arranged transport and documentation. He didn't plan the fraud or the conspiracy to cause death. He paused. Can you produce him if we need him? He's left Denver, she said. He told me he would. I don't know his destination, but his statement covers what he was present for, and it's consistent with everything else in that pile. And consistency across multiple independent sources is what makes a case, Aldrich said. He picked up the pen that had been sitting untouched on his desk and made a note. You've thought about how this presents in a proceeding. I've had some time to think, she said. Evidently, he set the pen down. The Mercer situation concerns me. If he acts before we can establish the conspiracy in a formal proceeding, the narrative becomes muddier. Harrington's attorneys will argue that whatever happened on the mountain was an independent action, that there's no provable connection to their client, that the documents are... He stopped. They'll argue what they can argue. The cleaner version of this is if we can establish the conspiracy before any violence occurs. We're going back to the mountain, Penelope said. Aldrich looked at her. I'd strongly advise against that. I understand, but if Mercer's people arrive at an empty cabin, the story becomes that we disappeared, which is what my father intended from the beginning. There's no proceeding in the world that resolves cleanly when the primary witnesses have simply vanished. She kept her voice level. If we're there, on the property, and Mercer attempts what he was sent to do, that attempt, witnessed and survived, is evidence of a different kind than any document. It's testimony. It's physical evidence. It's the conspiracy made visible in real time rather than inferred from paper. Aldrich was quiet for a moment. You're describing a situation where you and your husband are present on the property when a group of armed men hired to kill you arrives. I'm describing a situation where we're on our own property when people come to take it, she said. We know the terrain. They don't. We've had months to prepare. They're operating on a plan made by someone who hasn't been to that mountain recently and is relying on the assumption that we'll be unprepared. She paused. We're not unprepared. Caleb had been quiet for most of the exchange. Aldrich looked at him now. You agree with this? I agree with the assessment of our position, Caleb said. I'd rather not go back and have that conversation on that mountain. But the alternative, sus, leaving the property unoccupied and hoping the legal proceedings move faster than Mercer does, is a worse position than the one she's describing. Aldrich picked up the pen again and held it without writing. If something goes wrong on that mountain, he said, I need the chain of evidence intact. I need to know that whatever happens can be documented and brought to me in a form that doesn't require me to rely solely on the testimony of the people who were there. Burl, Caleb said. The man who runs the feed operation at the base of the pass. He knows me. If we send him down with a message as soon as the situation resolves, he can be in Denver in 3 days. And the situation will resolve one way or another before the main pass is fully clear. Yes, Caleb said. Aldrich wrote something, then he looked up. I'll move on Harrington Friday. Bring him in for questioning based on the addendum in Harlan's statement, which establishes probable cause for the fraud charge and gives me grounds to look at his accounts." He looked at Penelope. "When the title confirmation comes through from the commissioner's office, Pratt is filing tomorrow?" "Tomorrow morning," Pratt said. "When that comes through, I'll add it to the foundation. Harrington's attorneys will ask for delay at every stage, which is standard. But with what's in that pile, delay is harder to justify." He looked at the documents again. "The Fowler connection, the deputy registrar, I'll pursue that separately. That's an officer of the territory. That proceeding runs on its own track." "One thing," Penelope said. He looked at her. "There will be people who worked for my father who had no knowledge of what he was doing," she said. "Household staff. People who've been in his employ for years on the assumption that their situation was stable." She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. "When the asset review happens, and I understand it needs to happen, I'd like there to be some mechanism that protects them from the worst of it. They didn't participate in what he did." Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "That's a civil matter," he said carefully. "My office handles criminal proceedings." "I know," she said. "I'm raising it now, so you know it's something I'll be pursuing through the appropriate channel. I wanted you to know it because if my father's attorneys try to use the welfare of his employees as a rhetorical point in the proceeding, some argument about the human cost of bringing the case, I want you to know that the human cost of not bringing it was already being paid by the same people." Aldrich looked at her. Then he made another note. "Is there anything else?" he said. "Not today," she said. He stood, which concluded the meeting. He shook Caleb's hand again. He looked at Penelope. "Miss Harrington, Mrs. Montgomery." He stopped. "Either is accurate," she said. "When this proceeds," he said, "your testimony will be central to it. What you've put together here is substantial, but the jury will be looking at you and making a judgment about what kind of person brings a case against her own father, and I want you to be prepared for that." She held his eyes. "I'm prepared for that," she said. "I've been preparing for it since I was 8 years old, and my father started teaching me, without meaning to, exactly what kind of person he was." Aldrich nodded once. "Friday," he said, "and get back to your mountain." They left Denver the morning after the meeting, before the city was fully awake, and the road south felt different from the road north. Not in the physical facts of it. The cold was the same, the terrain was the same, the horses were the same, horses making the same sounds on the same roads. But she was different in it, and Caleb was different beside her, and the difference in them changed the quality of the road, the way the quality of light changed when clouds moved. She had come to Denver carrying everything they needed to make the case. She was leaving with the case in motion. The proceeding was Aldrich's now. The documents were in Pratt's safe behind the bookshelf that had survived 2 break-ins and a small fire, and Harlan's statement was part of a formal record, and the title confirmation would come through the commissioner's office by the end of the week. She had done what she had come to do. What was left was the mountain. On the second day of the return journey, crossing the long flat section east of the first serious climb where the snow was compacted enough for the horses to move well, Caleb said without preamble, "I owe you something." She looked at him. "What?" "An account. Of Mercer. You asked in Pueblo and I didn't answer fully." She waited. She had learned over the months that waiting was the correct response when Caleb was approaching something he needed to approach at his own pace. Rushing it produced a version of the thing, but not the whole thing. "I was in Wyoming in the summer of '76, he said. "Moving. The way a man moves when he's looking for the next thing and hasn't found it yet." He looked at the road ahead. "Before that, I'd been at a mining camp outside Leadville. The foreman—" He stopped. Found a different entry point. "The foreman ran things in ways that I said were wrong. I said so to the men above him, and when that produced nothing, I said so to him directly, which was a mistake in terms of what it cost me personally, though I'd make the same mistake again." He paused. "I left before it got worse. He filed a complaint with the territorial office claiming I'd taken equipment. I hadn't. But the complaint was enough to make Leadville and the surrounding territory uncomfortable for me, so I moved north." "The scar," she said, quiet. A silence. "The foreman's way of making a point," he said. The flatness of it was deliberate. She understood this now, the way his flatness was not absence of feeling, but the container for it, the way you needed a strong container for things that would otherwise come out sideways. I left before he could make a second point. He filed the complaint, and then, when the complaint didn't accomplish what he'd wanted, he hired Mercer. To come after you personally, she said, to come to Wyoming and remind me that the complaint was still active and that the foreman was still attentive to my whereabouts and that moving north hadn't resolved the situation. He looked at his hands on the reins. Mercer came alone that time, just to deliver the message. He was professional about it. No threats beyond the implied one, no violence, just a man making sure I understood the scope of my situation. He paused. I understood it. I also understood that the foreman would run out of money to pay Mercer before I ran out of ability to be somewhere other than where Mercer was looking. So I moved again, further, up into the San Juans eventually, and the complaint expired and the foreman moved on to other problems and I stayed on the mountain. You built something far enough away that it would cost more to come after it than it was worth, she said. That was the idea, he said. Turns out I built it on top of something that changed the calculation. She thought about this. Mercer won't remember you as a priority from '76, she said. You were someone else's problem that he was paid to deliver a message to. He's delivered 1,000 messages. He'll remember if he sees me, Caleb said. Men like him remember faces. It's professional habit. He won't know the connection to Harrington until he's standing in front of me, and then he'll know it all at once. Does that change the plan? No, he said. It means I need to make sure he doesn't have time to adjust his assessment before the ridge does what the ridge is going to do. He looked at her. The approach timing matters. I need to keep him in conversation long enough that he's where he needs to be when... I know, she said. I've been working out the timing. I need approximately 4 minutes on the ridge from the position to the shot. You need to keep them in the approach for at least that long after I've separated from you. You'll separate before first light, he said. That means you're on the ridge in the dark. I've walked that approach twice. I know where the bad footing is. You know where it was in January, he said. Late February melt and refreeze changes the surface. Then I'll be more careful, she said, and I'll go slowly. I have time if I leave before first light. He looked at her. I don't like this part of the plan. I know, she said. Which part specifically? The part where you're alone on a slope in the dark while armed men are below. The alternative is both of us at the cabin when they arrive, which eliminates the element of the ridge entirely and reduces our position to a cabin against 7 or more armed men with professional instruction. She looked at him steadily. Which plan do you prefer? He was quiet for a long moment. The horses moved through the compacted snow with the steady rhythm of animals that knew they were heading toward something familiar. I prefer the ridge, he said. So do I, she said. They rode in silence for a while after that. The mountains ahead were getting larger in the specific way that mountains grew as you approached them. Not gradually, but in sudden increments, as if they were waiting until you were close enough to reveal their actual scale. She watched them grow and thought about the North Ridge and the geometry she'd worked out and the single point of failure in the boulder field's base that she'd identified and memorized. She thought about Cord, who had ridden down this same road in the opposite direction last month with a message for Burl and a splinted arm and some new information about the kind of morning he was capable of surviving. She wondered if he'd gone back to Kansas or found a different kind of work. She hoped it was the latter, though she was aware that hope was not the same as likelihood. She thought about what Aldrich had said, that the jury would be looking at her and making a judgment about what kind of person brings a case against her own father. She thought about the answer to that question, which was not complicated. The kind of person who found out her father had arranged for her to die and did something about it instead of pretending she hadn't found out. She didn't think she'd need to say it that plainly in a courtroom, but she'd thought it plainly enough that she wouldn't be ambushed by the question when it arrived. On the 4th day, they began the serious climb, and the cold changed register again, and the horses leaned into the grade with the patience of animals that understood the work required and were doing it. She leaned forward in the saddle and let her weight help and thought about nothing except the next 50 yards of trail and the 50 after that and the altitude accumulating beneath them with every step. They reached the cabin late on the 5th day. She stood in the clearing for a moment before going in. The late afternoon light was doing something specific to the west face of the mountain, hitting it at the angle that made the snow surface look almost translucent, like something that was only apparently solid and was actually made of light. She had not been sentimental about the mountain when she arrived in November. She had not been sentimental about it during the winter. But standing in the clearing after 5 days of travel and 11 days in Denver, she felt something she recognized as the specific sensation of returning to a place that had decided to be yours, or that you had decided to be yours, and the decision had stuck. She went inside. She got the stove going. Caleb came in from the outbuildings, and they ate and talked through the timing one more time, adjusting for what they'd learned from Coldwell's freight contact about the approach patterns Mercer favored. She went to bed in the second room, the room with the narrow bed and 2 quilts and the window that looked into the North Pines. And she lay in the dark and listened to the mountains settle in the cold and thought about the next thing. Just the next thing. Not the thing after that. Not the full weight of what was coming. Just the next thing, which was to sleep, which was to be rested and clear-headed when the morning required her to be. She slept. They had 3 days before Mercer's men appeared. She used the time. The ridge approach. She walked it at 3 in the morning on the second day, with the temperature at what she estimated was 15 below and a half moon giving just enough light to navigate by. She found the places where the surface had changed since January. There were 2 sections where the freeze-thaw cycle had produced a glaze over what had been manageable footing, and she noted them and worked out alternate step placements for each, and went back to bed at 5 with cold in her feet that took an hour to fully leave. She dry-fired the rifle on the outcrop. She measured the distance to the base section of the boulder field again, using Caleb's method, counting known reference points, triangulating from 3 angles, and confirmed her original estimate, 60 yards. 62 at the outside. She had hit targets at 75. The distance was not the problem. The problem was that she would have 1 shot at the specific point that would initiate the cascade. 1 shot from an elevated position in early morning light that would be improving but not yet good, with her hands cold from the approach and her body still adjusting from the transition between the pine line and the open ridge. She could not control all of these factors. She could control some of them. She could manage her layers to keep her core warm on the approach, so her hands would have more circulation when she arrived. She could time the approach to arrive at the outcrop with enough time to settle before she needed to fire. She could take 3 slow breaths before the shot, the way Caleb had taught her in the 3rd month on the mountain. She practiced the breathing. She practiced it until it was automatic, until her body knew the sequence without her having to think it. The deliberate expansion, the controlled release, the stillness at the end of the exhale that was not held breath, but a natural pause where everything went quiet for just long enough. Caleb watched her practice on the 3rd afternoon and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You're ready." "I don't know if I'm ready," she said. "I know I'm as prepared as I can be in the time we have." "That's what ready is," he said. She looked at him. "Is that what it felt like to you? The first time you were in a situation that required—" She gestured at the rifle, at the mountain, at the general category of things they were preparing for. He thought about it. "The first time I understood something serious was about to happen, and I was in the middle of it," he said. "I was 22 and I was not prepared and it went poorly in several ways I won't go into." He paused. "The second time I was 24 and I was more prepared and it still went poorly in ways I hadn't anticipated. By the 3rd time, I'd learned that the feeling of being prepared and the feeling of being ready were 2 different things, and neither of them guaranteed the outcome. And the outcome was going to depend on what you did with what you had in the moment you were actually in." He looked at the North Ridge. "Which is the same thing you said. So I think you already know what I know about it." She thought about this. "That's not comforting." "No," he agreed. "It's accurate, though." "Yes," he said. "I try to be accurate rather than comforting when accuracy is more useful." "It's almost always more useful," she said. "I know," he said. "That's why I do it." She looked at the North Ridge one more time. The light was going out of the sky in the west, and the mountain was taking on the flat blue-gray of late afternoon in winter, and the boulder field was up there somewhere in the dimming light, holding its configuration of mass and angle and undermined base, waiting for the input that would allow it to become something other than what it currently was. She went inside. She ate. She checked the rifle one final time and set it by the door where it would be cold but accessible. She slept 7 hours without difficulty, which surprised her until she thought about it and realized it shouldn't. Her body understood what was coming and had made the decision, below the level of conscious choice, that sleep was the most useful thing it could do with the hours before it. The assault came at dawn. The man's name was Cord. She learned that while she was setting his arm. He told her without being asked, which suggested either that pain made him talkative or that the situation had reconfigured something in him, the way sudden reversals sometimes did, when a man had gone out in the morning expecting one kind of day and arrived somewhere entirely different. He was 26. He was from Kansas originally. He'd been working enforcement jobs for 3 years because the pay was better than freighting, and he'd been good at it, or thought he had been, until this morning. "Does this hurt?" she said, positioning the splint. "Yes," he said through his teeth. "Good. That means it's in the right place." She tied off the binding. "You need to keep that immobile for 6 weeks. If you go back to the kind of work you were doing before that's healed, you'll break it again, and the second time it won't set clean." He looked at her with the slightly dazed expression of a man who had come to a mountain to participate in a killing and was now receiving medical advice from the intended victim. "Why are you doing this?" he said. She sat back on her heels in the snow. "Because your arm is broken," she said. "That's sufficient reason." "We came here to—" "I know why you came here," she said. "You came because Mercer paid you to come, and the alternative was declining work, which is harder than it sounds when you need the wage." She looked at him directly. "I'm not your judge, but I'm also not going to let you ride off that mountain with an unset brake because it's inconvenient to treat you." He was quiet for a moment, then, "Mercer's not done." "I know," she said. "He rode east, but he's not the kind of man who accepts a situation like this and moves on. He'll regroup. I know what he'll do," she said. "That's a problem for another day. Today's problem is your arm and getting Burl moving down the pass." She stood up. "Can you ride one-handed?" He thought about it. "If the horse is cooperative—" "Caleb's gray is cooperative," she said. "You can take it to the town at the base of the pass. Leave it at the feed operation. Ask for Burl. Tell him Montgomery needs him to ride to Denver with a message. He'll know what it means." She looked toward the cabin, where Caleb was standing in the doorway, watching this exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read from this distance. "The horse will find its own way back eventually. They do." Cord looked at her for another moment. He was reassembling something in his understanding of the world. She could see it happening, the slight disorientation of a man who has operated on one set of assumptions for years and is finding the ground less stable than he'd thought. "I'm sorry," he said, for what we came to do." "That's between you and yourself," she said. "Get on the horse." Burl got the message down in 3 days. She knew this not because anyone told her immediately, but because on the 8th day after the boulder field moved, Pratt arrived at the cabin with a territorial deputy and 2 documents she needed to read sitting down. The first was a formal registration of title confirmation from the territorial commissioner's office, signed, sealed, dated 3 days after she and Caleb had left Denver, which meant Pratt had moved the moment they were out of his office. The chain of title from Coldwell through Sellers to Caleb Montgomery was confirmed as complete and properly registered. No competing claim could be filed. The 10-year clause had been satisfied in full. The land, the mountain, the silver beneath it, legally and permanently established as belonging to the man who had been living on it for 6 years. She read it twice. She folded it carefully and held it in her lap. "The second one," Pratt said from the chair across the cabin table, his hands wrapped around the cup of coffee Caleb had given him, "is more complicated." The second document was a summary of proceedings from the territorial prosecutor's office, covering the 11 days since Aldrich had brought Arthur Harrington in for questioning. She read it with the attention she'd given to everything she'd read in this cabin, thoroughly, without rushing, catching the specific language that mattered. Her father had been questioned on Friday as planned. He had arrived with 2 attorneys and the specific composure of a man who believed his position was impregnable, which was, she thought, the most characteristic thing about him. Not cruelty, not ambition, but the absolute certainty that he had built his walls high enough that no one could reach him. The attorneys had objected to the scope of the questioning. Aldrich had presented Harlan's statement. The attorneys had objected to its admissibility. Aldrich had presented the addendum to the contract with Harlan's confirmation of its provenance. The attorneys had asked for a recess. During the recess, one of the attorneys had apparently gone to Harlan's lodgings to discuss the situation. Harlan had not been there. Harlan, exercising the judgment of a man who had done his calculation and was committed to his side of it, had made himself unavailable in a way that turned out to be permanent. He'd left Denver on the Wednesday train, and his destination was not recorded, which was both an inconvenience and, in its own way, a confirmation. The questioning resumed. On the following Monday, with Burrell's message in hand confirming what had occurred on the mountain, Aldrich had expanded the proceeding from questioning to formal charge. Arthur Harrington was charged with conspiracy to commit land fraud, conspiracy to obstruct territorial land registration, and she read this line 3 times, conspiracy to cause the deaths of 2 named individuals for the purpose of enabling the above. He had been taken into custody on Tuesday. His assets, pending resolution of the proceeding, had been placed under administrative review by the territorial government, which in practical terms meant that the accounts from which his attorneys drew their retainers had been temporarily frozen, which was a detail she suspected had not been included in the document by accident. She set the summary down on the table. The cabin was quiet. Pratt was watching her with the careful neutrality of a man who dealt professionally with the way news landed on people. Caleb was at the stove and had not turned around since she started reading, giving her the privacy of his back, which she recognized as consideration. "He's in custody," she said. "As of Tuesday," Pratt said. "The asset review. Standard procedure in cases of this scope. It doesn't prejudge the outcome. The assets are reviewed, not seized. If the proceeding resolves in his favor, they're released." He paused. Aldrich does not expect it to resolve in his favor. She looked at the window. Outside, the March light was coming into the clearing at a different angle than February light had, warmer in quality, though not yet warm in temperature, the kind of light that reminded you the world was still turning in the direction of something other than winter. "His reputation," she said. "Already moving," Pratt said carefully. "The business community in Denver is, when a man of your father's position is brought in for questioning, the community responds before the facts are settled. Some of his associates have begun distancing. Some of his contracts are under review by the other parties." He paused again. "There's a particular satisfaction in watching a man discover that the relationships he believed were loyalty were actually contingent on his continued power." She looked at him. "Is that professional opinion or personal?" "Both," he said. "I've had occasion to watch it before. It never stops being instructive." She picked up the title confirmation again and looked at it. She thought about the way her father had signed his name in that study. Not hesitating, not troubled, just signing the same way he'd signed everything in his life. The practiced certainty of a man who had never been asked to account for his certainty. "Pratt," she said, "when the proceeding concludes, and I understand it may take months, possibly longer, what happens to the Harrington assets that are legitimate, the properties and holdings that aren't directly connected to the fraud?" Pratt looked at her with the particular attention of a man receiving an unexpected question. "That depends on the specific findings. Some would be unaffected. Some might be subject to civil claims by parties who can demonstrate harm." He folded his hands. "Why?" "Because there are people who worked for him," she said. "Household staff. People who've been in that house for 20 years with no other arrangement and no savings because he paid them barely enough to manage." She thought of the housekeeper who had brought tea to her room every morning for her entire childhood without being thanked by anyone in the family except Penelope, who had learned to say thank you early because it seemed like the correct response to someone doing something kind, and because her father's indifference to it had struck her, even as a child, as a deficit worth correcting. "I'd like to make sure they're not left without anything when this comes apart." Pratt was quiet for a moment. "That's a complex undertaking," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to solve it today. I'm asking you to think about what's possible." He looked at her for a moment longer, then wrote something in the small leather notebook he carried. "I'll think about it," he said. After Pratt left, she and Caleb stood in the cabin in the particular quiet that follows the departure of someone who has brought significant news, the kind of quiet that isn't empty, but is instead full of the thing that's just been said. "It's over," he said. Not with triumph, more like a man checking whether a structure was still standing after a significant event. "The immediate part is over," she said. "The proceeding will go for a while yet. We'll need to go to Denver for testimony." "Yes." She looked at the title confirmation on the table. "But not yet. Not until they need us." He looked at her. "What do you want to do in the meantime?" She thought about it. She stood in the cabin that had been, she recognized this as she stood in it, her home for 4 months, in the specific way that places became home, not because you were born in them or assigned to them, but because you built something real inside them. She looked at the books on the shelf. She looked at the 2 mismatched chairs. She looked at the supply shelf that she'd reorganized in the first week, and that had stayed organized because they'd both learned the system. "There's a family in the valley," she said, "the Reinhardts. You mentioned them last month, the ones who'd had trouble with their roof after the January ice. What about them?" "I'd like to go help with the roof." He looked at her steadily. "You want to go fix someone's roof?" "We have the lumber in the barn," she said, "and the weather is going to hold for another week at least if the mountain is reading right, and a family with a bad roof in March is going to have a hard spring." She looked at him. "Also, I think it's time to start being neighbors, properly. We've been here long enough." He considered this. "The Reinhardts have 4 children," he said. "I know. The oldest is about 11 and she talks constantly." "That's fine," Penelope said. "I've been relatively starved for conversation." He almost smiled. "I talk," he said. "You talk when something needs to be said," she corrected him, "which I respect enormously, but sometimes a person wants to hear about an 11-year-old's opinions on things." He looked at her for another moment with the expression she'd never quite been able to fully decode, the one that seemed to contain more than she could read from the surface of it. Then he said, "All right, we'll go to the Reinhardts tomorrow." She nodded. She picked up the title confirmation and the proceeding summary and carried them to the shelf above the books, where she'd started keeping important documents. She put them there with the same care she gave everything she filed. Not precious exactly, but respected, handled like things that had cost something and were worth keeping correctly. She turned back to the cabin. "Caleb," she said. He was already pulling on his coat for the evening rounds. He looked at her. She had been thinking about something since the morning on the ridge, since the moment after the boulder field moved and she'd come down through the trees and found him crossing the clearing with his eyes going to her immediately. She'd been thinking about the word she'd said outside Pratt's office, the word that had surprised him more than she'd intended. She'd been thinking about the way he'd put his hand on her shoulder in the aftermath of Mercer's departure, steady and still and not asking anything from her, just being there. She'd been thinking about all of it and trying to figure out what to do with it, and had mostly concluded that the problem with knowing your own feelings was that it required you to do something about them, which was uncomfortable. She was not, however, a woman who had walked away from discomfort this winter. "The arrangement we came into this as," she said. "The contract arrangement. The one my father made." He went very still. "I'd like to not be in that arrangement," she said. "I'd like to be in a different one." She held his eyes. "One that we made ourselves, if that's something you want." The silence lasted long enough that she started to wonder if she'd misjudged something fundamental, which was an unpleasant thing to wonder while someone was looking at you. Then he said, "That's the thing I've wanted since about the 3rd week." "The 3rd week," she repeated. "You reorganized the supply shelf," he said. "I'd been meaning to do that for 2 years, and you did it in an afternoon, and the system was better than the one I would have used." He paused. "I thought, well, there's a person worth keeping." She stared at him for a moment, then she laughed. Not the short, dry laugh she'd produced at her father's table in that first conversation, but a real one, longer, the kind that surprised her by its own existence. "You decided because of the supply shelf," she said. "It was a very good system," he said seriously. But something in his eyes was doing something she hadn't seen before, warm, unguarded, actually present in a way that was different from his usual quality of attention, which was already considerable. She crossed the cabin and she kissed him, which was the most decisive thing she'd done since firing at the base of the boulder field and was considerably less complicated to execute. He kissed her back, which answered the last question she'd been holding. They went to Denver in May for Penelope's testimony. The proceeding had moved faster than Pratt had predicted, partly because Aldrich was a man who treated momentum as a resource not to be wasted, and partly because 3 of Arthur Harrington's former associates had come forward with their own accounts once it became clear which way the situation was moving. Men like her father accumulated enemies the way they accumulated everything else, efficiently, without realizing the accumulation, because the people you dispose of on your way up tend to remember the disposal even when you've forgotten the person. The territorial courthouse was not as grand as Denver's city buildings, which Penelope had always thought was actually appropriate. Courts were about function, not impression, or should be. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the room, which was full in the particular way of proceedings that had become public interest, and she answered Aldrich's questions with the same directness she'd practiced on that mountain since November. She told the truth about what she'd heard through the door. She told the truth about the train platform, and Harlan, and the 11-mile wagon ride through snow. She told the truth about finding the document on the supply shelf. She told the truth about Denver and Coldwell and Pratt and the conversation in the chop house. And she told the truth about the morning on the North Ridge, which she did not dress up or make more dramatic than it already was, because the truth of it was dramatic enough. She was on the stand for 4 hours over 2 days. Her father's attorney, a different one than the first 2, who had apparently found reason to reduce their involvement, attempted several times to suggest that she was motivated by personal grievance, that her account was shaped by the specific distortion of a daughter who had been difficult and resentful, and who was now exacting retribution for imagined slights. "You had a contentious relationship with your father," the attorney said. "Isn't it true that you were, by most accounts, a source of considerable frustration to him?" "By most accounts," she said, meaning by his account and the accounts of people he'd told. "You don't dispute that there was conflict." "I don't dispute that he found me inconvenient," she said. "I dispute that inconvenience is the same thing as conflict. A piece of furniture that's in the wrong room is inconvenient. That doesn't mean the furniture is the problem." From the gallery, she heard something that might have been a stifled sound of agreement. She didn't look to see where it came from. She looked at the attorney who had moved on to his next question with the efficiency of a man who recognized he'd lost that exchange and wasn't going to invest more in it. Caleb testified the following morning. He was on the stand for 2 hours. He answered questions the way he did everything. Directly, specifically, without elaboration that wasn't asked for, and without omission of what was. When the attorney tried the same approach with him, suggesting personal motivation, suggesting that his account of the arrangement was shaped by grievance against a wealthy man who represented something he resented, Caleb looked at him with the particular patience of a man who has heard a mischaracterization and is deciding whether it merits correction. "I bought my land legally 6 years ago," he said. "I built what I have on it by working it. I've got no general grievance against wealthy men. I've got a specific objection to this one trying to kill me to get what I built." He paused. "I think that's a reasonable distinction." The attorney sat down. Arthur Harrington was in the room during both testimonies, at the defendant's table, and Penelope looked at him once, directly, without flinching, in the way she'd learned to look at things she needed to see clearly. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not physically. He was the same lean, silver-haired man he had always been. But in some other dimension, the way a building looked smaller once you understood its construction. He didn't look at her. He looked at the table in front of him with the expression of a man who had always believed he controlled the room and was discovering that rooms had their own opinions. She didn't feel triumphant. She'd expected to, or had expected to feel something that resembled it. The specific satisfaction of a wrong being righted that stories usually delivered at this moment. What she actually felt was more complicated and quieter. Not forgiveness. She had no interest in performing forgiveness she didn't feel. Not hatred, because hatred required ongoing investment and she had better things to invest in. Something more like finality. The recognition that the thing was concluded, that the chapter with her father in it had an end, and the end was here, and everything after this was a different book. The finding took 3 days. Guilty on the primary fraud charge. Guilty on the land conspiracy. Guilty on the charge of conspiring to cause death, the language was careful because Mercer's men had acted and failed, and the deaths in the Boulder field were matters of law still being argued in their own proceeding. But the intent was established clearly enough that the charge held. The Harrington Railroad assets connected to the fraudulent land scheme were subject to forfeiture. The personal assets, the house, the legitimate holdings, were placed under a court administrator pending civil claims. Deputy Registrar Fowler, whose name had appeared in Harlan's statement, was removed from his position and charged separately. She heard all of this in the courtroom on the third day, sitting next to Caleb, and when it was over she sat for a moment while the room moved around them and thought about the document she'd found on the supply shelf in December and the woman who had found it. That woman had been standing in a wolf coat over a ballroom dress, shaking from 3 days of accumulated fear, trying to figure out how to survive the next thing. She hadn't been brave exactly in that moment. She'd been terrified and exhausted and operating on the specific motivation of someone who has run out of alternatives. What she'd done since then had not been a transformation. She was insistent about this in her own mind, because the story that said she was broken and became strong was both easier and less true than what had actually happened. She had not become a different person. She had become a more fully realized version of the same person, which is a different thing entirely, and the difference matters. The qualities that had made Arthur Harrington treat her as a problem, her stubbornness, her directness, her refusal to accept a surface explanation when she could see the machinery underneath, were the same qualities that had undone him. He had tried to eliminate what he found inconvenient and had instead sent it somewhere it could develop without interference. The mountain had not changed her. It had simply given her room. She thought about Mrs. Grantham, who she had not yet been able to find and properly thank. She thought about Coldwell on his porch. She thought about Cord with his broken arm, who she would probably never see again, riding Caleb's gray horse down a mountain pass with his arm in a splint, and some new information about the kind of person he'd chosen to be. She thought about all the women she'd known in Denver who had smiled through dinners and swallowed the particular indignity of being evaluated rather than encountered, and she thought about how many of them had things inside them that the rooms they lived in had never given space to. She thought, that is the real waste, not what was done to me specifically. What is done routinely to women who have nowhere to go where the air is thin enough that the surface pretenses fall away, and what remains is just what you're actually capable of. Ready? Caleb said quietly beside her. She looked at him. He was already standing, holding his coat, looking at her with the patient attention she'd become accustomed to and had come to understand over the months, was not patience in the passive sense, but something more active, a choice made continually to give her the space her father had spent a lifetime removing. Yes, she said. She stood. They did not return to live in Denver. This was not a dramatic decision. It didn't feel like a statement, didn't feel like a rejection or a victory or a symbolic act. It was simply what they wanted, which was so straightforward that she found herself, weeks later, still slightly surprised by how clear it was. She had spent her life wanting things that required translation before she could admit them, and here was a thing she wanted that required none. The cabin stayed the cabin, though it expanded over the following year. A proper second bedroom added to the addition, a larger workspace off the barn, a covered porch on the south side where the afternoon light came in good in summer. The Reinhardt's roof held through the spring, and Martha Reinhardt, who was 34 and had been managing a homestead with 4 children and a husband who worked himself to exhaustion regularly, became the first person Penelope had called a friend in years. It was an uncomplicated friendship, which was the kind she'd never had before because Denver friendships were never uncomplicated. Martha said what she thought. She laughed loudly. She had opinions about everything from livestock management to the territorial government to the correct way to make a pie crust, and she advanced these opinions without much concern for whether they were welcome, which Penelope found restoring in some essential way. "You know what I heard about you," Martha said one afternoon in July when they were sitting on the Reinhardt porch, shelling beans while 3 of the 4 children ran circuits through the yard for no discernible reason. "Before you came down to help with the roof, what people in town were saying." "Something unflattering, presumably," Penelope said. "That Montgomery had taken a woman from the city as some kind of indentured arrangement, that you were probably a criminal or a fallen woman, or both." Martha shelled 3 beans rapidly. I told the woman who told me that story to look at who was telling it and consider whether she'd seen you herself. Had she? No, Martha said. Which was my point. Penelope looked at the mountains from the Reinhardt porch. They were the same mountains she'd looked at from the cabin window every morning, different angle, same mountains, the same permanence that had struck her that first night on the train, as honest in a way she hadn't had words for. People tell stories about women they haven't met, she said. It's easier than meeting them. That's true, Martha said. Though I will say, now that I have met you, the story is considerably less interesting than what actually happened. What do you know about what actually happened? Martha looked at her sidelong. I know your father is in a territorial prison. I know the Harrington Railroad lost 3 of its primary land grants. I know that the title on your mountain is cleaner than any title in the San Juans, registered and confirmed by the territorial commissioner himself. She paused. And I know you shot at a boulder field to start a slide that took out 6 hired men, and I have questions about that, frankly, that I've been waiting for the right moment to ask. This seems like the right moment, Penelope said. Was it terrifying? Martha said. Yes, Penelope said simply. But you did it anyway. The alternative was worse. Martha was quiet for a moment, shelling beans. Then she said, I think about that sometimes. The alternative being worse. She looked at the yard where her oldest daughter, the 11-year-old who did in fact talk constantly and who had, over the course of the summer, taken a strong shine to Penelope for reasons that seemed mostly related to the fact that Penelope listened, was explaining something at length to a fence post. Living up here, the way we do, there are things I'm afraid of all the time. Weather and sickness and whether we're going to make the season. But the things I'm most afraid of, I keep doing anyway because the alternative is not doing them. And then where are we? Penelope looked at her. Where are you now? She said. Martha considered this. In a good place, she said. A hard place, but good. Penelope thought that was about the most honest description of a life she'd heard. What? The silver came into production the following year. Not quickly. Mining silver from a San Juan mountain was not quick under any conditions, and doing it in a way that didn't destroy the terrain they lived on required thought and time, and the kind of management that didn't cut corners because the corners were where they lived. Caleb was involved in every decision about how the extraction proceeded, which meant it proceeded more slowly than a purely commercial operation would have, and more carefully. And the men they hired to work it were paid what the work was worth, which was more than the going rate, which was something she insisted on and which he agreed to without argument. She handled the financial and legal side of the operation. This surprised people who didn't know her and surprised nobody who did. She had a head for numbers and a talent for finding the point in any contract where the weight wasn't distributed evenly, which turned out to be a talent that transferred cleanly from surviving her father to running a mining operation. The territorial lawyers who dealt with them in the first season had arrived expecting a mountain man's wife to be decorative or silent, or both. They adjusted their expectations over the course of the first meeting, which she considered a reasonable use of a meeting. The money from the silver went several places. It went into the ranch, which expanded to include a small operation that offered work and housing to people who'd arrived in the mountains with nothing and needed a start. Not charity, work, real work with real wages. The kind of arrangement that asked people to contribute what they could and gave them what they needed to build something. It was not a large operation. It was not, in the first years, a particularly smooth one. People were complicated, and arrangements were complicated, and there were failures and conflicts. And at least 2 situations that required Caleb to have conversations she was glad she wasn't present for, though he reported on them afterward with his characteristic flat accuracy. Some of the money went to Coldwell, not because he'd asked for it or expected it, but because he was 73 and had helped them when he didn't have to, and she thought that deserved acknowledgement in a form more durable than gratitude. Some of it went, through Pratt's patient and creative legal work, into a fund for the former Harrington household staff. It took most of a year to structure, and there were complications she had not anticipated, but it held together, and the people it was meant for received it, and the housekeeper who had brought tea to her room every morning for 15 years without being thanked by anyone except Penelope was now living in a modest house on the south side of Denver with enough to live on and without the anxiety of dependence on a man whose situation had collapsed. She did finally find Mrs. Grantham. Not in Denver. She'd moved to Colorado Springs, which turned out to be where she'd wanted to live for 20 years and hadn't because her late husband had preferred Denver. She was growing roses. She was bad at it by her own assessment, but she was learning. "You should have run when I told you to," Mrs. Grantham said when Penelope came to see her. "I went back for my things," Penelope said. "Which is how I heard what I heard, which is how we got the evidence." Mrs. Grantham looked at her over her terrible roses. "So your disobedience was productive?" "It seems to have been," Penelope said. Mrs. Grantham made the sound of a woman revising an assessment she'd held for some time. "I watched your father for 20 years, she said. "I watched him make people disappear. Not literally, most of the time, but effectively. People who might have been something just stopped mattering because he had enough resources to make them not matter." She looked at the roses. "I told you to run because I thought it was the best you could do. I was wrong. I'm glad I was wrong." "The $40 helped," Penelope said, "for what it's worth." "Keep it," Mrs. Grantham said. "Consider it an investment in the outcome." But Arthur Harrington served his sentence. She did not see him again. She thought about going once, thought about sitting across from him in the visiting room and trying to find something in it that would resolve what she felt or didn't feel or felt in configurations she didn't have clean names for. She thought about what she would say and what he would say and what either of them could possibly get from the exchange that would be worth the cost of it. She didn't go. She decided that the proceeding had been her testimony and his accounting, and that was enough. The idea that she owed him a final conversation was one of the last pieces of the old training she had to consciously remove. Because the old training said, he is your father, you owe him something, the relationship requires maintenance. The newer understanding said, what she owed him was exactly what had been given. The truth, clearly and completely stated, in a room with proper witnesses. She had given that. She did not owe him her time on top of it. This is the thing they don't tell you about the end of a harmful arrangement. They talk about escape, and they talk about recovery, and they talk about strength, but they don't talk about the administrative work of dismantling the internal architecture the arrangement built. The constant low-level vigilance, the instinct to make yourself smaller in the presence of a strong personality, the way certain tones of voice still triggered a specific quality of alertness. She did this work mostly quietly, mostly without talking about it, though she talked about it sometimes with Caleb, who listened the way he always listened, without trying to fix anything that didn't need fixing, and without pretending it was something other than what it was. "Does it get better?" she asked him once, late in the first winter after everything. He thought about it. "Different," he said. "It gets different, and different is better, usually, when you give it enough time to settle." She believed him because he was a man who said accurate things more often than comfortable ones, and because she was already finding it true. Down. She was 25 years old in the spring. The silver came in, and the ranch had its first full season, and the Reinhardt girl, whose name was Nora, and who had been talking to fence posts when they met, began coming to the cabin on Tuesday afternoons to learn to read from the books on the shelf, because it turned out that what had looked like constant talking was actually a child trying to fill silence with the sounds of a mind that had more in it than its current situation was engaging. Penelope taught her the way Caleb had taught her, directly, specifically, without ceremony or condescension. She taught her from the same books she'd learned from, and from some she'd ordered new from Denver because the shelf was getting full, and she'd decided that was not a problem, that a shelf getting full of books was in fact the opposite of a problem. On a Tuesday afternoon in May, when the light was good and the mountains were doing what they did in May, visible and enormous and already showing the green coming back at the lower elevations, Nora looked up from the page she'd been working through and said, out of nowhere, "Were you scared when you shot the rocks?" Penelope looked at her. She was 9 now, had been 8 when this all happened, and she had absorbed the story the way children absorb the stories of people they admired. Not skeptically, but also not passively. She'd been processing it. "Yes," Penelope said. "But you did it anyway." "Yes." Nora thought about this. She was the kind of child who actually thought about things, which was rarer than it should be. How do you know when to do the scary thing anyway, and when the scary feeling is right and you shouldn't? Penelope set down the book she'd been holding. She thought about it seriously, because Nora deserved a serious answer, and because it was genuinely not a simple question. "The scared feeling is always right," she said. "It's there because something real is at stake. The question isn't whether to listen to it. The question is what it's asking you to be careful about." She paused. "Sometimes it's asking you to avoid something, and sometimes it's asking you to pay very close attention while you do it anyway." Nora considered this. "How do you tell the difference?" "Practice," Penelope said, "and being honest with yourself about which one is which. It's easy to tell yourself you're being prudent when you're actually just afraid. And it's easy to tell yourself you're being brave when you're actually being reckless." She looked at the mountains through the window. "The honest part is the hard part." Nora looked at the mountains too, then back at the page. "Okay," she said, and went back to reading. Penelope watched her for a moment. This child with her serious face bent over a page, working through words with the same determined patience she brought to everything, and felt something she would have had difficulty naming precisely. Not contentment, which was too static. Not happiness, which was too simple. Something more like rightness. The sense of being in the correct place doing the correct thing, which is different from perfection and better, because it doesn't require anything to be other than what it is. Outside, Caleb was doing something in the barn that involved intermittent hammering. The sound was irregular and practical and completely ordinary. The mountains were there. The light was doing what Maylight did. Nora turned a page. Penelope Harrington had been sent to a mountain to disappear. She had not disappeared. She had instead done what she'd always done, which was to look at what was actually in front of her and figure out what came next. She had done it in an evening dress and borrowed boots and a wolf coat that smelled like pine resin and something wilder underneath. She had done it in a chop house and a lawyer's office and on a north ridge with a rifle and in a territorial courthouse on 2 consecutive mornings. She had done it imperfectly, with fear and with shaking hands, and with at least 3 moments where she had genuinely not known if the next thing would work. That was the truth of it. Not that she'd been exceptional, but that she'd kept going anyway, which is what exceptional usually turns out to be when you see it from the inside. Not the absence of fear or failure or doubt, the willingness to take the next step in the presence of all 3. She picked up the book again. Outside, the hammering stopped and the mountains were quiet, and the afternoon light came through the window at exactly the angle it always did at this hour, falling across the shelf of books like it had decided that was where it belonged. She had decided that too.